This meeting is being recorded.
Morning, everybody. Morning to those who are just joining. Hello, we can hear you. Morning to people just joining. We're going to get started in just a minute. I am eventually going to ask everybody to share screen, or not to share screen, to turn on your camera if you're able. So feel free to go ahead and do that now. We're going to try to encourage some engagement today while we're together in the virtual room. But if you're still sipping your coffee and gathering yourself, you can wait for my slide that tells you have to do it. All right, I think I'm going to go ahead and get us started just for the sake of time. We're expecting 25 people. We have 22 in the room, so we may have a few more trickling in, but I'm going to jump right in. We have just 4 hours together today, and we have a lot of material that we're going to cover. So get comfortable, get your coffee or your tea or whatever it is, and we're going to dive in. I'll start by introducing myself. I know some people. Hello to some friends out there, Kathy, Sean, Trisha, hi guys, welcome. So I'm Kate Menifee. I work at the Western Mass Food Processing Center, which is a shared use commercial kitchen in Greenfield, Mass. And so we've worked with some of you. We've been around for about 21 years now, and we really function as like an incubation space for new food businesses. So we do lots of R&D and prototyping with people as they're getting started, including a lot of farms. And I know we have a lot of farms in the room today. And then we really now also function as a small batch co-packer. So helping people as they're kind of starting and growing over their first few years of launching a food product. And we do lots of technical assistance on food science and food safety and a lot on regulatory compliance. And so we'll be digging into all of those today. So I'll let I'm going to let the other instructors introduce themselves in just a moment, but first just want to provide some preliminary information to get us set up for the day. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And if someone could just give me a shout out to confirm you're seeing my screen.
I can see it.
Awesome, thank you. So welcome. The title of our class today is called Successful Food Product Development for New Food Businesses, Managing Food Quality and Food Safety. And the material that we're presenting is really going to be relevant to anybody that's considering launching some kind of value-added product, consumer packaged good. I think first and foremost, just shout out to UMass Amherst and University of Rhode Island for developing this material. I think maybe 3 or 4 years ago now.
Yeah.
4 years, I think.
Yeah.
So this material was developed using with funding from a USDA NEFA grant, and has been just like an invaluable resource for people doing product development technical assistance. in the region. And actually, before I jump into the program goal, also want to give a shout out to CISA, communities involved in sustaining agriculture, for helping as the organizer today. So shout out to you guys for supporting recruitment and logistics and getting everybody in the room today to be together. This program was really developed as a way to provide foundational food safety information to people considering launching a food product. So the whole goal is really to get you thinking early and often about food regulations that you have to comply with and ways that you can implement food safety practices in your operation, so that you can be making a consistent product every time and incorporating food safety practices into your processes early so that you're not thinking about them after the fact. So this course was originally designed as a 2-day class and has been implemented many times as a 2-day class, both in person and virtually. However, we taught the material together. Some of the partners in the room hosted this class in June, and the 2 days online just really felt like a lot. So we met after the fact, put our heads together to think about the next class and decided we wanted to restructure and try something different. So we asked all of you to participate in the self-paced version of the full course online prior to coming. So thank you to everybody who was able to do that. That information I think is going to be really helpful to help you sort of apply the concepts, the more complicated regulatory and food safety concepts that we're going to be talking about today. So today, rather than 2 days, we're just together in the room for 4 hours, and we're going to deep dive into the highlighted sections. So we're covering those 4 highlighted sections today. I sometimes think of them as the hard skills that we present in this class. So food science, food safety, regulatory compliance, and helping you think about how to implement food safety programming in your operation and ultimately how to create a food safety plan. And we'll talk about HACCP as well. So this is what that agenda looks like for today. So we're going to do some intros. We'll try to be quick with those. We'll do 2 sections, and then we'll take a short 10 or 15 minute break. And then we'll do, that'll be around 11, I believe. And then we'll do 2 sections after that, and we'll wrap up it for 1. And we are planning to host some office hours sessions next week as a space for y'all to come and ask questions about things that came up for you, either online or today. And we'll talk more about those in our wrap up. Before I do that, I just want to quickly mention the sections that we aren't covering. Everybody who was able to do the self-paced version online saw this material. But what we aren't covering today is the product development lifecycle, which is really some of that bigger picture thinking around how to launch a new business venture. So thinking about doing market research and analyzing your target market and coming up with sort of a profile for your target consumer, and then tailoring your prototype and your design and your packaging to that person. It also involves thinking about doing a cost analysis of your business and some projections for your first few years. So if you need support with those kinds of things, the partners in the room are available to help you with those. And you can come to the office hours to ask more questions about what that life cycle typically looks like. Food labeling regulation is a little bit complicated. You saw some of that in the online version of the class. The FDA puts out an amazing guide that's structured as a Q&A that's pretty easy to find online. If you can't, let us know. In that section, we generally talk about what's required on a food product label. And then we also talk a lot about the nutrition facts panel and what's expected there. So we'll be missing that content today, but you got some of that online. And again, you can come to the office hours to learn more or schedule a private appointment with one of us to talk specifically about the label you're thinking of, to talk about your product. And then controlling food quality and safety. We talk a lot about how to make a product shelf stable and about product quality in this section. So thinking about things like pH and water activity and temp control and kill steps. So we'll be referencing a lot that comes up in that section in the other sections today as we're talking about food safety practices. Quickly, just want to introduce the cookie exercise. Everybody already saw this online, but just want to point out that we're going to be using the concept of a cookie product and a cookie manufacturing process to reinforce some of the concepts that we're introducing today. So I think this is a good one because I'm hoping that everybody in the room at some point has baked a chocolate chip cookie, has made a batch of cookies. So that process should be sort of relevant to you all, thinking about buying your ingredients and, taking them out and setting yourself up and mixing those ingredients and then eventually baking them and maybe packaging them in some way, if you can dare to imagine that. So we'll be referencing that. And then we know that we have a lot of farms in the room. So we're also going to try to work in some examples of things that you might be thinking about, like a tomato sauce or a pesto or a pickle. And I know some people in the room are already thinking about those products. So we'll do our best to do that. But as you're posing questions, feel free to reference the product that you're thinking about so we can try to be more specific in our answer. So one of the pieces that we did ask you to prepare as homework for the class was a product description for the product that you have in mind. I know it's also possible that maybe people don't have a specific product in mind, but I imagine many of you do. Getting really clear on your product and your product description is helpful as far as putting together a food safety plan is going to go, and as far as getting your team all on the same page around what you're doing. And ultimately, it's going to help when you find yourself in the room with an inspector or you're doing something like preparing for a third-party audit. This helps everybody get really clear on what it is you're doing from the onset. So this is just that example for the cookie, for our baked cookie. So you can see the product description goes a little bit deeper into what exactly it is we're making. It's all natural, it's preservative free, it's a shelf-stable chocolate chip cookie. We outline our ingredients, noting any allergens in that next row. And then also to talk about packaging. What ultimately, how is this going to look? How is this going to end up in a box and at a store? Intended use, intended consumers. We reference the shelf life, and then labeling instructions, and then instructions for storage and distribution. So just wanted to pull this out and have you thinking about it as we dive into the content. Some quick housekeeping, just expectations as a virtual class. We are going to ask that everybody turn on their camera and please be engaged during the class. We're going to save a little bit of time at the end of each section for questions, but also please pop questions into the chat as we're going, and the instructors and CISA are going to help to monitor those. So some we can maybe answer right in the chat, and then we'll save some time to try and respond to those at the end of each section as well. And we will be hosting 2 office hours next week to dive into things that we don't have time for today. And we'll talk more about that later and announce the times for those. Okay, so I wanted to go around the room and do introductions. I saved about 15 minutes for this. So if everybody could keep it relatively brief, maybe 30 seconds per person. And if you could just say your name, talk about the farm or the organization where you're coming from. I think also where you're coming from would also be helpful, the town that you're coming from and state, and then just mention the product that you're thinking about.
I'm Tim Carroll from Farmer Tim's Vegetables. I'm a vegetable farmer in Central Mass, and looking at the things you mentioned, the tomato sauce, salsa, pickles, who knows?
Awesome, thanks. Do you want to actually, let's have people call on the next person if you don't mind.
Oh, Jody?
Hi, I'm Jody Gorman, and I'm the owner of Happy Jars, and I do soups and salads in glass jars. I live in Lincoln, and I'm considering marketing my salad dressings and perhaps my croutons.
Awesome.
Pete, my friend from Lincoln.
Hi, I'm Pete Lowy from Codman Community Farms in Lincoln, Massachusetts. And we have a new commercial kitchen we built on the farm, and we're looking to start making some value-added products here and potentially getting into other value-added vegetable products when we have excess inventory.
Awesome, thank you. I'll go ahead and call on Christian.
How about Benito?
Right. My name is Benito Torres. Oh, wait a minute. My name is Benito Torres. I'm from Puerto Rico, Arecibo, and I get United States, and I learned what my grandma teach me, like, grow vegetable and the other grandma and the animals and things like that. So, and when I get here, I like to always do something about farming things. And I worked 16 years in tobacco farm, and always I like being the farm. And I had 1 acre land, and it's a rental for now, but I want to keep up because I'm a line cook, and I'm want to, doing new stuff. Like I want to buy a house with a farm, and first floor I want to do a restaurant, and the second floor is for me and my wife, and the land is to people come to get the vegetable, like have something new, like people can walk in there, take it out problem house and those things like that. Good environment for the community. And I love being a farmer. I love to work in the soil. I like to be outside with the natural thing it is. I cannot be in home. I'm sorry. I'm home today because I went to work today because I want to take this meeting, and I'm online cook certified, and I just want to learn more, whatever I can learn to keep doing safety things for the people that consume the food.
Awesome. Thanks, Benito. Do you want to call on the next person?
I don't see anybody in my pictures.
Oh, I can do it for you.
Okay.
I see Lillooet Farm, I think is how you say it. Lillooet.
Hi, I'm Nathaniel, and Doug is here. Lillooet Farm, we were making cheese, sheep's milk cheese, gosh, 3 years ago. And when I had my second daughter, we stopped making cheese and stopped milking.
Mhm.
And we have this great creamery space that's very thoughtfully put together that we're going to transition to be doing fermented veggies, sauerkrauts, kimchis, hot sauces. We also still sell meat and wool, and have a small nursery, tree nursery,
Wow.
tree nursery. So a lot of stuff going on, but what we're here for is well, a good refresher after a few years. I definitely have our HACCP plan put together for cheese making. So some parallels to fermented veggies, but we've got a lot of friends in the area just north of Boston, northeast of Boston, who grow veggies and are always looking for ways to have value-added products. So we're going to be kind of hopefully be sort of the cooperative space to work with other farms to make veg. So yeah, I also can't see the next in line. So do you mind picking one for us?
Nope, that's great. Thank you for all of that. I will pick Crooked Trail Farm.
Hi, my name is Erica. I am with Crooked Trail Farm. My partner and I started this farm as about 4 years ago. We're raising livestock for meat mainly and eggs, and we would like to add some bone broth products. So as I understand it, meat products are kind of a tough one for the community kitchen. So I guess I'll need to speak with someone more about that, but just looking to learn some of the preliminary info that we'll need to do that safely.
Great, thank you. Well, do you want to pick the next person?
I can't see anybody that had, oh, hold on. Christian.
Hello, everyone. I'm the founder and co-owner of South River Miso Company in Conway, Mass. And we've been making miso here since 1982. But we're in a new phase of our work here, in that there's some other products that we can introduce, and also just ongoing, in an ongoing way, wanting to bring our work and our product up to speed with the current regulations and learnings about food safety, and that might help us in our work going forward.
Great.
And I would introduce Alex Garberg, who's also working with us.
Hi, everyone. I'm
Hey
Alex.
there.
You want to say something?
Yeah, I work in the miso shop, hoping to produce the miso. And yeah, I'd say we have a pretty traditional way of doing things, and it would help to be able to find a way to keep it as traditional as possible while making sure that it's safe.
Always a good goal. Great. Thanks, guys. I have a tub of your miso in my fridge that we use all the time. It's good to see you in person.
I'll pick someone.
Okay, how about Kobe Unger?
Hi, I'm Sadie. Kobe's my partner, and we have a small garlic farm together, and we're interested in bringing garlic-based value-add products to market. I also work on a diversified veggie farm, so anything veggie related is of interest to me too. And we're in the greater Boston area, kind of split between Taunton and Weston.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, welcome. I will call on Sean Rice.
Shan, that's right. Hello, that's me.
Hey.
I'm a individual vegetable grower, similar to Tim, who went first, interested in general products such as sauces, and pickles are a big one. We grow a lot of cucumbers. So I'm early in the phase and in looking at how one could sell them. Also interested in syrups, like that you could add to cocktails or drinks.
Awesome, thanks. Don't get me thinking about cocktails at 9 in the morning. Let's go to Lee. Hey, Lee Nichols. You're muted still, but then if you unmute, I think we can hear you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, my name is Nicole. I'm the founder and the owner of Wise Mouse Tea. Our product is 100% tea, 100% natural tea. Also, a new product will be vegetable tea. So
Lee, we actually can't hear you.
Together with tea leaf or together. No, that's my grandmother was used to help people. So now.
Lee, we actually can't hear you. You're breaking up too much. Unfortunately, we can see you, but it's really breaking up.
Can you hear me now?
A little better.
If you turn your video off, we won't be able to hear you.
Yeah, I can also give like a quick summary of her products as well.
Oh, great.
If that would be helpful. So Lei is the owner of Wise Mouse Tea. Is the shelf-stable tea beverage, has 18 months shelf life, and she also just launched pickled vegetables product, shelf stable.
Awesome.
I'm pretty sure I sampled your products at the fancy food show and they were delicious.
Oh, yes. Thank you.
Let's go with Gustavo.
My name is Gustavo Agudelo, and I have started my farm this year. This has been my first year with the farm, Agudelo Farm and Apiary. I've been doing beekeeping since 2019, and some of the products that I'm interested in getting into are sofrito for cooking, produce that I could get off the farm and make the sofrito with, and then honey products like creamed honey, flavored creamed honey, things like that.
Awesome, thank you. Those sound fantastic. Great, let's go with Will English.
Hi, my name's Will. I represent Edible Homescapes, which is a sustainable market garden out of Westport, Massachusetts, actually owned by my brother, who unfortunately couldn't make it today, so I'm filling in for him. We grow a variety of vegetable products as well as some fruit products, mostly strawberries. And we're looking to turn those into various jams, possibly fruit leather or jerky, whatever the term is, and a variety of pickles for all the vegetables we grow.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Will. Welcome. Let's go to Kathy. Kathy Denai. Hello. Oh, we actually can't hear you, Kathy. Looks like you're unmuted, but we can't hear you. Nope.
I wonder if her microphone's not there.
Yeah, the microphone might not be connected, but I know Kathy, and she's in Connecticut and has a farm and also makes a fabulous pickle product, as well as lots of different baked goods and fudges, some in her commercial kitchen on site and some off site. Good to see you, Kathy. Hope I didn't totally butcher that. Let's go to Sean. Hey, Sean Rainford.
Hey there, I'm Sean Rainford, Director of the Worcester Regional Food Hub. We are located in Worcester, and we are a distributor of local food. So once you're ready to sell, I'm interested in produce and all your value-added items. We sell primarily to institutional buyers like schools, colleges, hospitals, as well as folks serving underserved communities. We also run a food business incubator. We have a shared use kitchen. Many of our folks are not necessarily farmers, but they are immigrants or children of immigrants, and they want to share their cultural cuisines with the world. So we have sales opportunities available for those folks with a new marketplace. We also help people prepare for wholesale permits. We have folks that are making sauces and granola and all kinds of different things. And I will, let's see, am I picking?
Yeah.
Actually, I don't know that I can see anybody on my screen that hasn't gone already.
I can pick for you. I'll pick Trisha. Hey, Trisha. Oh.
Sorry, new computer setup today. Good morning, everyone. My name is Trisha. I actually work with Kate at the Western Mass Food Processing Center, which is housed at the Franklin County CDC, Community Development Corporation in Greenfield, Mass. I actually head up the Mass Ag Innovation Center. So my role is to help all of you farmers develop value-added products. So feel free to reach out. We'll make sure you get that info at the end of today's session. But yeah, thanks. And I will pass it to Jody. Did you go yet, Jody?
I'll go. Hi, my name's David DiFrancesco with Rhode Island Farm Incubator. We're in North Kingstown, Rhode Island. And so we're initially a farm incubator. We also have a farm called Shiwatuck Farm. And we're looking to develop some products and also help other people develop products and kind of get our feet wet with this. So I'm here to learn. Nice to meet everyone. Thanks. Sorry, I don't have a video feed. I'm on a computer with no camera, and you know, I typically am growing lettuce, so it's new. Thanks.
That's fine. As long as you can see slides, you should be fine. And let's
Sorry,
go
see
to.
who?
As long as you can see the slides, then you should be okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry.
Kate, can you hear me now?
We can. Yes.
Ah, good. Okay. Thank you. My daughter fixed it.
Okay. That's what daughters are good for.
Absolutely.
I think, okay, it looks like most people have gone. I think Chris, I don't think you've gone.
Hey, my name is Chris. I'm a prospective food truck owner in a rural town in Massachusetts. I've spent the better half of this year trying to change legislation around our current town's laws dealing with that. Food trucks are only allowed permitted events, and I was hoping to get a year-round gear. So while that was happening, I have a commissary that's been burning some space, and I decided to try and retail some jarred sauces, and it turns out that's an entirely different beast. So that's why I'm here.
It turns out it is. Well, welcome. Thanks, Chris. Let's go to, well, David, it looks like you're from the Rhode Island Farm Incubator, but I don't think you've introduced yourself. you must work with our other friend who just introduced himself.
Possibly. Who were you referring to?
Oh, you know what? I bet you that's his computer and his
Oh,
phone.
it's my
It's one of
phone
his-
feed. Yeah,
Oh, you're David. Okay, sorry about that.
that's me. Yep.
Hey, hello again.
Thanks.
Okay, is there anybody who is not an instructor who hasn't had the chance to introduce themselves and their product? I think that's everybody. So let's go ahead and have our instructors introduce themselves. Nicole, do you want to start?
Sure. Hi, I'm Nicole Richard. I'm from the University of Rhode Island. I've been here for about 18 years, and I worked on this project with Amanda, and it's been great to just continue to provide this educational program to folks in the region, and online has made it easier to do that. So I'm thankful that you're all here today, and I look forward to what we're going to cover.
Great, thanks, Nicole. And Ploy.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ploy. I am the Director of Educational Programs for Commonwealth Kitchen. We have 5 kitchens in the facility. 4 of them are shared kitchen space that we have that for our, small businesses. And then the 1 kitchen is the co-manufacturing kitchen. We also do farmer value-added products as well and help the farmers develop products and, launch value-added products. Yeah.
Awesome, thanks, Ploy. And then let's have our friends from CISA introduce themselves. Soraya, you want to go first?
Hi, I'm Soraya Barros. I'm a program coordinator at CISA, and I usually do on-farm food safety, everything that is related to that. This is what I do daily. And lately, I've been transitioning to helping value-added products. So if you need help in anything around that at CISA, I'll be the person to help you. You have my contact information already. We have been emailing you, and I'll let Molly introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Molly. I'm a program assistant. You got a couple emails from me, and I'm just here to help with logistics, make sure everything goes smoothly. Nice to meet you all.
Thanks, Molly. Thanks, everybody. Okay, so I think we're in a good place to go ahead and get started. My final slide in the intro presentation asked if there were any questions. Is there anything people are needing an answer to before we go ahead and get started? Okay, then I think we can dive right in. Again, we're going to do 2 sections before a short break, and then we'll do 2 sections after and wrap up right at 1. And I'll let Nicole take it away.
Oh, okay. Okay, here we go. Let's start off with hazards. So hold on, I just have to shrink this one thing down. Okay. Okay, so the goal of this module is to identify the types of food safety hazards that you might encounter, and then potential sources and growth parameters. So really trying to understand bacteria and why they're a problem. So let's start off with what is a hazard? This is a definition in the regulation, and the hazards that we're referring to are any biological, chemical, or physical agent that has the potential to cause illness or injury. There are different types of hazards, biological, chemical, and physical hazards, and we're going to discuss all 3 of these, but focus most on biological. Biological hazards are they cause the most foodborne illness, so that's why we're going to focus most of our efforts on biological hazards. So what is a biological hazard? So when I talk about biological hazards, I'm referring to microorganisms such as bacteria, viruses, and parasites that can cause people to become ill, or they can cause harm to people that consume either the bacteria or the toxins that they produce. Microorganisms, what do we mean by microorganisms? They include bacteria, viruses, molds, and parasites. They can be good and bad. If there's a lot of people doing fermentation in here and you know a lot about good bacteria, there's a lot of good bacteria out there that help us ferment foods, that help keep us, that do keep things healthy. There's lactic acid bacteria that helps with fermented products. Molds used in tempeh and blue cheese help these products become, what the final product that we're eating. But when I'm talking about microorganisms and food safety, what I'm really referring to are the bad bacteria, the viruses and parasites, bacteria and molds that make people sick. So for example, E. coli, Salmonella, Listeria, and Clostridium botulinum. And that's what I'm going to focus, we're going to focus a lot on, just the bad bacteria. So one of the biggest problems with microorganisms is that they're so small you can't see them, so you can't tell when they're there. You can't use your senses to determine if a biological hazard is present. So that makes prevention so much more important. What are the sources of biological hazards? They pretty much come from everywhere. They're in the agricultural environment, such as soil, water, humans. They come in ingredients and on raw materials, and people are also a culprit. So thinking about where they come from, now we can start thinking about factors that contribute to risk. Poor personal hygiene is one of the factors. Improper heating, not cooking something to the right temperature, or not cooling it quick enough so it stays in a warm temperature longer, where bacteria will thrive and grow. Unsanitary storage conditions can cause contamination or cross-contamination of with products, and then cross-contamination between clean and dirty objects, whether it be utensils or clothing or things that touch the food. So this isn't a comprehensive list, but it's just some of the main causes of biological illness. So when we talk about prevention, because we can't see bacteria, we really want to focus on preventing bacterial growth or bacteria from getting into the food. And there are different strategies that we'll use that will depend on different things. Some will be the intrinsic or extrinsic factors of that food itself. And I'm going to talk about all of these points on this slide in more detail. What are the conditions for microbial growth and how do we manage that? What other factors might contribute to growth of bacteria? And what is our organism of concern? So these factors and conditions can be managed to control for biological hazards, and we'll discuss each of these in more detail shortly. There are different ways the bacteria can make us sick. Sometimes they cause an infection, and this is where you ingest the live organism in the food, and then that organism grows in your body, causing you to become ill. And E. coli is an example of this. There are other bacteria that produce toxin in the food, and when you consume the food with the toxin, that toxin is what makes you sick, and that's an intoxication. And that's usually an example of that is Clostridium botulinum. It will produce toxin in the food, and then that toxin can make people very ill. In addition to different ways in which they make us sick, bacteria can also come in two different forms. There's the vegetative state, and then some bacteria, not all, but some form spores, which if you think of it as sort of like a seed, it has a protective coating. When the environment isn't really ideal, it sort of goes into the spore form where it can survive. And then when the environment becomes conducive for growth, it will break out of the spore and germinate and produce toxin, or just germinate, whatever, the spore formers usually produce toxin, so producing toxin. So spores are harder to kill than vegetative cells. So if you're cooking something and your goal is just to kill salmonella, you might have a lower cooking temperature than if you're heating something to, say, destroy the Clostridium botulinum in the food, which is why, for canning, we have the water bath canner for acidic foods, but then for foods that, because Clostridium botulinum, which is a spore former, is associated with low acid foods, that pressure can is needed, or the retort is needed to get to that higher temperature to kill the spores in the food. If you can't reach that high temperature, then sometimes you're adding acid, and that decreases the pH and then prevents Clostridium from becoming an issue. So there are different ways in which you can control spores, and we will talk about all of that as we go through this module. Bacteria grow very quickly. It's a logarithmic growth where one cell becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, and they multiply very quickly over a period of time. So under the right conditions, they can grow very quickly to high numbers. Many factors and conditions can influence microbial growth, and sometimes you need to control multiple factors or conditions to achieve the goal of decreasing the likelihood of microbial growth. And this is the hurdle concept. So you can control a microbe's ability to grow by adjusting not just a single factor, but a combination of growth factors. And by growth factors, I'm referring to things that impact the ability of microorganisms to grow, such as the temperature that the food is at, the time that it's sitting at that temperature, what's the nutrient availability of the food? You know, different foods have different nutrients that are going to be available for bacteria. Like vinegar doesn't have a lot of nutrients available. It's very acidic. Nothing's really going to grow in there, versus like a steak, which has more nutrients that are available for bacterial growth. Water activity is another parameter, which is really important. That's by lowering the water activity, you're lowering the amount of water available for microbial growth. pH is important. pH is usually measured on a scale referred to as, well, pH is usually referring to the acidity of a food. So a low pH can prevent bacterial growth, whereas a higher pH may not slow bacteria from growing. And so sometimes, you know, you see like we decrease the pH of canned foods so that we can water bath can them. And we talk about pH a little bit more. Oxygen, the availability of oxygen. Some bacteria like oxygen and some don't care. So when you take something and stick it in an oxygen-free bag, maybe you're not dealing with some bacteria, but now you've selected for other bacteria, and you need to be aware of those considerations. Finally, ingredient additions, if you're adding anything to the food that could support the growth of bacteria or introduce bacteria. So I mentioned intrinsic and extrinsic properties, and when I'm referring to that is for intrinsic properties, that's referring to the properties of the food product. So in this example on the slide, that would be the pH of the cucumber, versus extrinsic, which is the properties of the environment around the food. And this includes storage conditions and packaging. So in this example on the slide, we're looking at the oxygen-free environment in the jar of pickles, and that vinegar would be part of that extrinsic environment. And what is important when you're acidifying is to make sure that the pH of the pickle lowers enough to, you know, be in line with the pH of the acid so that it gets to a low enough pH. You want to make sure that the acid is absorbed by the pickle. There are different conditions for growth, time being one of them. Bacteria need time to grow. This scale shows the traditional growth curve for bacteria starting in the lag phase. The log phase is sort of that exponential growth where they grow pretty rapidly. And the stationary phase is usually the bacteria have sort of eaten up all of the nutrients, and the food might start to decay. And then as there's not enough nutrients available, the bacteria will die off and the food is probably pretty spoiled by then. When you're controlling bacterial growth, you want to sort of keep it in the lag phase. You want to maintain low levels of bacteria in the food. Temperature is another condition. You want to identify which microorganisms have the potential to grow at the temperature that your product is being held at, or at the temperature that it might be held at during processing. So you want to consider modifying conditions to control particular organisms. And, you know, some bacteria can grow in refrigerated temperatures. So Listeria monocytogenes is one of those, which is why we have the issue with deli meat and deli ready-to-eat salads can be an issue with Listeria because it can survive and grow in the refrigerator. Water activity is another thing I mentioned, and this is a measure of the amount of water in a product that's available for chemical reactions and microbial growth. So by lowering the water activity, you can stop chemical reactions from occurring, and you can slow or prevent microbial growth. And this table on this slide is just showing the water activity for different food products. And you can see, you know, instant coffee is very low, powdered milk is very low, versus fresh meat and fish, which is close to 1. Oh, I forgot to mention, water activity is measured on a scale of 0 to 1, with 1 being what water, pure water would be. So in below 0.85, 0.85 is sort of that magic number where, oh, never mind, that's on the next slide. I'll talk about that in a minute. So like I was mentioning, 0.85 is sort of the magic number for water activity. So if you look at the top part of this slide, you can see that it's showing you the water activity and then where the bacteria like. And so Staph aureus can grow down to a water activity as low as 0.85. So 0.85 is sort of that magic number. Below 0.85, you really have no pathogen growth or toxin production. So the goal for like decreasing water activity in a lot of foods is to get it to below 0.85. However, some foods are lower. On the bottom part of this chart, it's just showing the different water activity for different food products. And, you know, it's just for cake, you can see there's a big range there. And that's just because some cakes are dry, some cakes have cream fillings, and there's just a range of water activities for cake products. pH is another important factor, and this is sort of an expression of how acidic or alkaline a product is. pH is measured on a scale of 1 to 14, with 7 being neutral, and that's where water sort of comes in. Most foods that we eat are acidic, and they have pH ranges from about 2.5 to 6. And then at the bottom on the chart on this slide, you can see that different bacteria have different ideal pH growth ranges. So Bacillus cereus on the top has a growth range of 4.3 to 9.3. And if you think about in restaurants, they acidify, in restaurants that make sushi, they acidify the rice. So Bacillus cereus is usually associated with starchy, grainy products like rice or pasta. And but when they're making sushi, they need the rice to be warm so that it can bend around the sushi rolls, and so it's more pliable. And in order to keep it at that warm temperature, which is a temperature range where bacteria would like to grow, they therefore acidify it to 4.2 or lower so that they can keep the rice at the warm temperature. It's acidified, and you don't have to worry about bacillus growing or producing toxin because it won't grow at that low pH. Clostridium botulinum is the next one in line, and that growth range is 4.6 to 9. With canned goods, usually you're canning to below 4.6, and that's because of Clostridium botulinum. It likes oxygen-free environments. It's usually associated with improperly home canned vegetables, and therefore the acidification is important. If you can't acidify a canned good, that's when you either pressure can or retort it. And that's reaching a higher temperature because you don't have pH as that barrier. Different bacteria have different oxygen requirements. Aerobic bacteria like oxygen to grow. Anaerobic bacteria can grow without oxygen. And then there's facultative microbes that grow with or without oxygen. So when you create one condition, for example, with vacuum packaged like deli meat, by vacuum packing sliced deli meat, you might the lack of oxygen will slow spoilage organism growth, but you've selected for some pathogens that might like that oxygen-free environment now. So you need to have ways to control them. So temperature, so like, so Clostridium botulinum could be an issue in vacuum sealed deli meat, but if you stick it in the refrigerator, that's why it's stored in the refrigerator, then you don't have to worry about the Clostridium growing because it won't grow at the low temperature. And then I know a lot of people are doing fermentation, and another influencing factor is other bacteria being present. And this is sort of the principle under competition. So some bacteria grow poorly in environments with other bacteria. Staph aureus is an example. It won't grow very well if there's other bacteria around. So it's really important when you're fermenting products to have a clean, sanitary workspace so that you don't introduce Staph aureus into the food, and to make sure that that you're selecting for lactic acid bacteria that will grow and decrease that pH so that you don't have to worry about any other pathogens. Other examples include adding preservatives and then just the food itself. Different foods, you know, some food like vinegar isn't going to support the growth of much because it's so acidic. So now we have a hurdle exercise. So in our chocolate chip cookie, what were some of the parameters that we use for controlling microbial growth? If anyone wants to take themselves off mute and just chime in.
Well, the baking process was one of them, correct? It was heating the cookie to a temperature at which the microbes would have died.
Yes, exactly, temperature. And there was one more. So we heated it to a temperature, and what happened?
dried out, so the water content went very low.
Exactly. Thank you. So temperature, we cooked the cookie to make sure we killed any salmonella or other pathogens there. And in cooking it, we also decreased the water activity. So now that product can sit on the shelf. Great. So if you produce a food product with a high water activity, what are other potential ways to control growth? Any suggestions or ideas?
Temperature and acidity.
Yeah, temperature, you can store it in the refrigerator or freezer to slow any bacterial growth. You could lower the pH to prevent bacterial growth. So those are just, so this is, you know, using that hurdle concept to think through ways to manage bacteria. And there's no one-stop shop for controlling microbial growth in food. You can control multiple parameters, and that can allow you to decrease the risk in food products. So now let's move on to viruses. Examples include hepatitis A, E, and norovirus. Viruses do not need food, water, or air to survive. They can survive in human intestines, water, or food for months. It's usually the fecal oral route, so it's contaminated food handlers' hands or utensils that have been touched. Commonly implicated foods are fruits and vegetables that have maybe been irrigated or washed with contaminated water, prepared sandwiches, and shellfish. Prepared sandwiches, you know, maybe food handlers have contaminated it if they have are carriers of the virus. And then shellfish, it's usually associated with the waters that it's coming out of. Parasites is another concern. There are two types, parasitic worms and protozoa, that we're concerned with. They need a host to survive. They can survive in feces and animal tissue. Again, consumption of raw, undercooked meats and seafood, produce treated with contaminated water, or infected food handlers are usually causing the transmission. And commonly implicated foods are raw, undercooked meats and seafood and produce. One nice thing about parasites is that if you cook it properly, you can kill it. And then there's also freezing at a certain temperature for a certain period of time is used in the seafood industry to kill to kill some of the parasites that might be in fish. So a lot of that raw fish that we eat at sushi markets, a lot of the times, some of it is previously frozen to manage parasite issues. So for biological hazards, we sort of call it the 3 Ks for managing them or minimizing biological hazards. The first is to keep it out, and this is the ideal way to minimize hazards. Source control or supply chain control is really important to make sure that your ingredients aren't coming in with hazards. And employee practices and training is really important to minimize the introduction of hazards. If you can't keep it out, the next best thing you can do is to kill it. And this might involve a lethal process such as heat, but it can also include freezing or the addition of chemicals to manage, or antimicrobials to manage the bacteria. One thing that you need to think about is, you know, are you killing it before you package the food or after you package the food? Because if it's before you package the food, now you have an environment that maybe could contaminate the food, and you need to just be aware of that and consider how you're going to control for that. And then lastly, you want to keep it from growing. If you can't keep it out or kill it, keep it from growing. This is usually done through temperature control or product formulation. And then the packaging environment is important. Is it aerobic, anaerobic, or do you have a modified atmosphere? And what considerations might you have depending on how you're packaging it? So sometimes they work together. It's not always just one. Keep it out, kill it, keep it from growing. An example of this could be pasteurization of milk. You know, you pasteurize milk to kill pathogens, but you still have some spoilage organisms in there. So we keep them from growing by putting the milk in the refrigerator. Okay, so now we have a glow germ exercise, and I'm going to just show this video. And if you aren't a germaphobe yet, you might be one after.
Nicole, I can't hear the sound. I don't know if other people can.
Okay. Hold on. I probably am doing something wrong. Let me go to the... share sound. Okay, let's start over. Let me know if this works.
Yep,
it worked.
Okay, good.
If you go to the toilet and you don't put the lid down before you flush, when you do flush, then the germs that are in the toilet will then spread around the toilet cubicle, which means that they could land on the toilet seat or on the toilet paper itself. And that means that they can be spread onto your hands and other surfaces later on. We know from studies that around 3,000 organisms can be found per square inch on a keyboard and over 1,600 on a computer mouse. Now, this means that over the course of the day, you might be picking up those bacteria. And then if you suddenly decide to have lunch at your desk without washing your hands first, you're basically transferring those bacteria into your mouth. Around 16% of us carry the norovirus without actually having any symptoms. So you may feel perfectly fine and well, but in fact you could be carrying that organism and spreading it to other surfaces around the office inadvertently if you don't wash your hands after going to the toilet. I'd always recommend using a hand sanitizer when you leave the washroom. This means that if someone else has forgotten to wash their hands, then you haven't picked up their germs and then spread them around the office. And over the course of the day, it's always a good idea to use a hand sanitizer. To combat the sneeze effect, you can use the seat cleaner to make sure that you wipe the germs away. Effective hand washing is one of the simplest ways to stop infection in the office. It's been found that 47% of illness can be reduced by people simply washing their hands effectively, and just 20 seconds of hand washing can stop the journey of the germ. Afterwards, you need to dry your hands thoroughly because it's been found that germs are more likely to be transmitted to other surfaces if your hands are damp. So dry your hands completely and you've done the job properly.
Okay. So to go along with that, we have, hold on. Okay, it is here. We also have pictures where, hold on, on the left, you can see the hands, they have the black light over them so that there's iridescent can show like the germs that might be on their hand. And then on the right, you can see they've gone and harvested the strawberries and the germs can transfer to the crops and to the produce. So washing hands is really important at decreasing the spread of pathogens. Okay, so now let's move on to chemical hazards. A chemical hazard is a substance that can occur naturally from a formulation or otherwise be unintentionally present that can cause people to become ill. Undeclared allergens are the leading cause of recalls. An allergen is a chemical hazard. So sources and factors of chemical hazards, they can be naturally occurring substances in food and ingredients. They can come from unintentionally added chemicals that are part of the formulation, but I mean, not part of the formulation, or intentionally added during processing from chemicals that are part of the formulation. Allergens, toxins of microbial origin are both examples of chemical hazards. Allergens being, usually being the food itself. Toxins of microbial origin include mycotoxins, which can come from grain products. Scombrotoxin is usually associated with seafood, and shellfish toxins. There are action levels established by the FDA for certain toxins. So if, scombrotoxin has an action level. So it's just something to be aware of if you want to check it out. There are, for action levels, there's the guidance for industry action levels for poisonous or deleterious substances in human food and animal feed. Currently there are 8 foods that cause about 90% of the allergic reactions. And you need to make sure that these are labeled on all food products that contain them. It includes milk, eggs, fish, crustacean shellfish, tree nuts, peanuts, wheat, and soy. It's soon to be 9. Sesame is going to be added in 2023. So mycotoxins are toxins produced by fungi that are capable of causing disease and death. Common foods affected by mycotoxins include corn, peanuts, and wheat. And examples of mycotoxins can include the aflatoxin, fumonisin, and patulin. Patulin is usually associated with apples. So these are just examples of naturally occurring substances that can be chemical hazards in your food. It's usually, a lot of the times, these are managed by supply chain controls. Chemical hazards can also come from formulation that are unintentionally added. This could include accidentally using cleaning chemicals if they're not properly labeled and they resemble food. Agricultural chemicals are another example. We don't largely worry about those here in the US because it's pretty heavily regulated, that we don't see ongoing issues of high levels of pesticides or fertilizers in our food. Heavy metals is something to be aware of, especially if you're importing spices or things like that, because sometimes the heavy metals can be contaminated with, or the spices can be contaminated with heavy metals or adulterated, I mean. And drug residues is another thing, which is usually associated with like meat products. Sometimes we have chemicals in the formulation. We say this is intentionally added for beneficial purposes, but can be unsafe at higher levels. So preservatives, antimicrobials, or other additives, at a certain level, they're safe, and we need to make sure that when we add them to the food that we're adding the right amount. So how do we minimize chemical hazards? Through product design and flow. You can assess minor ingredients for the need in the formulation of the product. Does each ingredient have functionality? Make a detailed listing of ingredients. Are there any hidden allergies? Maybe you can design that out if possible, but if not, it's okay to have allergies in your or allergens in your product. You just need to make sure that you're controlling for that by making sure it's properly labeled. You need to consider how the product interacts with the processing line. Are you using the same equipment with allergens and other things people have sensitivities to? It's important to prevent the cross-contamination. Supplier approval records and employee training and education is also important for minimizing hazards. Employees need to know what their role is in keeping a safe food and why things are important to do. So now for chemical hazards, in our cookie example, what are some of the potential chemical hazards that we might have?
Sanitizer from the work surface.
That could be one. But that would be, hopefully we have good manufacturing practices that minimize that from being a risk, but that could be something.
Wheat.
Wheat, yes. We have wheat we have allergens. We have wheat, we have milk, and we have eggs in our cookies. So those are the main chemical hazards that are jumping out that we want to control. And then, other hazards that could be introduced, like the cleaning chemicals from cleaning, that would be managed. We would manage that so that wouldn't be a problem by making sure we follow good manufacturing practices, or, making sure everything's properly labeled so that there isn't that risk of someone grabbing the wrong thing while they're making the food and putting a chemical into the food. So, like I mentioned before, it's okay to have allergens in your product, but you're required by law to label them. So and labeling is the leading cause of recalls. So clearly there are issues with labeling. So it's always, so you need to double check your labels and make sure that you have the right label on that food. Now moving on to physical hazards. A physical hazard is anything that has the potential to cause harm to someone who consumes the food. Usually it's extraneous matter not normally found in the food. With physical hazards, what I really want to mention is that I'm really focusing on what causes safety issues, not what's just a quality issue. Like a piece of hair in food is a quality issue. It's not a safety issue. So for physical hazards, we're really focusing on just what can cause someone to be injured. Foreign objects are responsible for the vast majority of consumer complaints. And we want to make sure that we don't have any choking hazards or anything that's going to cut someone's internal organs up as it goes through their body, like wire bristles from a grill brush. There are many sources of physical hazards: glass, metal fragments, nuts, bolts, screws, twist ties, etc. Looking around is one way that you can minimize physical hazards, like light fixtures. Do they have plastic coverings? Or do you have this exposed light right over where you're making food? You look through your facility and think through, are there any physical hazards that could come from anywhere? Maybe you have a no glass policy so that you don't have to worry about glass as a physical hazard. There are different ways to manage this. So some of the ways to control physical hazards are maybe you substitute equipment, packaging materials by having a no glass policy so that you don't have to worry about breakage. Sometimes you can retrofit your facility or equipment so that there's less pieces that might be there, to nuts and bolts that might fall into the food. If you're using tools, you want to be aware of any potential breakage, like wire brushes. So there should be a protocol maybe for inspecting things that could cause physical hazards. And lastly, choking hazards. You want to understand not only the size and shape, but other parameters that can impact food as being a choking hazard. So what are some of the physical hazards from our chocolate chip cookie example? And if you haven't reviewed this recently, it may not jump out at you, but if you think about the process of making it, where might a physical hazard come into play?
Metal shavings from the mixer.
Yes, thank you. Metal fragments from our metal mixer at the mixing step. We have metal on metal, and that we could have fragments. So we need to be aware that that might be a physical hazard, and we're going to inspect our mixer. So in summary, a hazard is defined as any biological, chemical, or physical agent that has the potential to cause illness or injury. Biological hazards include bacteria, viruses, and parasites, and you usually control them through the use of the hurdle concept with time, temperature, pH, water activity, oxygen content, etc. Chemical hazards are often introduced in agricultural or factory settings. Allergens are the most common chemical hazard, and labeling and checking your labels is the most important thing you can do if you have allergens in your food, to make sure that it's properly labeled. And then physical hazards, include those harmful extraneous matter that should not be in your food product. Does anyone have any questions about hazards?
Well, it's not a question, but when I take the certified line cut classes, they show me that it's not supposed to be when you're cooking any type of chemical thing. You're supposed to follow the rule, the nerve, the BNR, the head net, and you have to wash your hands 20, 15 seconds, mostly rub your hands, backwards, your nails and everything. As soon as you start doing that and follow the procedure, it's more easy to you than whatever.
Yeah. And hand washing is so important, and doing it properly. We did for a project, we did a hand washing experiment where we washed our hands and then we like swabbed our hands. And let me tell you, I thought I was a good hand washer, but I was not. My hands were gross. And it really opened my eyes up to how much you really need to scrub your hands for 20 seconds.
There's a lot of things news in here that I never heard about in the school either. So that's why I'm kind of not confused. It's like, because never thought about the milk, gonna dry out the cookie and, kill anything that's in there or whatever. But I would thought the right temperature is to cook it only. Right? So it's the procedure to cook the cookie is a lot. It means to cook it, it means kill everything, and you have to be careful when you come out with that, how you're gonna put in the container too, So
Yeah.
it's a lot.
Yeah. We're in the next section, and I think maybe in the last two sections too, we're going to talk about the different ways to control some of the hazards that we just talked about. And some of those have to do with what you're talking about, like a kill step, cooking it for, at a certain temperature for a certain period of time. And then when we can't do that, we look to other ways to control for hazards, like good hygienic practices of your employees. So that falls under good manufacturing practices or good sanitation, which we've referenced. So we'll talk more about some of that too. Restaurants fall under the food code, whereas, specialty food products, any sort of packaged good, it's a different regulation essentially. And we'll get into that in the next section. A little bit stricter for sure. You're muted, Benito.
That's why you need to do it, things like that, like grow like business something, because I don't want nobody to hurt, but I'm that's kind of work so much that I was like, I'm confused about this and that, but I think it's need more time to practice all those things, and then you can have it with you all the time.
Yeah, the regulations get much stricter when you're making something that you're going to sell in a sort of a wholesale distribution kind of way, rather than giving it directly to the consumer, like in a restaurant or like at some other like retail establishment. So we'll talk in a minute, actually, in the next section about what some of those regulations are. We had until 10:15 for hazard, so I'm happy we're a little ahead of schedule. Are there any questions? We have another few minutes.
I have a question about pickling. So I assume like when you boil water with salt and then you pour that on in the jar with the cucumbers or whatever, that's a kill step and you're using temperature?
No, I don't think it's considered.
Okay, good. I'm glad I asked. What is the? Okay.
I think because it's not going to be hot enough long enough for, I think, it to be a kill step. I don't think it's considered a kill step. I think that that's why with fermenting, are you talking about fermentation or just pickling?
No, I'm just talking like you take a jar of cucumbers and, put in some vinegar and you boil water and vinegar and salt and then pour it in the jar.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's very hot, but then you can it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, no, that the canning part is the kill step.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, you're not able to really control when you're like putting a hot liquid into a jar.
Yeah.
If we're like doing hot sauce or tomato sauce, you can control that it's going into the jar at the right temp. Like that's the kill step. But for pickles, usually the solids aren't hot, right? And so the cucumbers go in and then the hot brine goes over. But then, yeah, you have to have that water bath step.
Oh, okay. So even though the water is like at a very high temperature and you're pouring it over the cold vegetables, it's not really killing it because of the temperature. It's when you seal it that it kills it.
Yeah, the heat during the water bath is going to be long enough where it will, that's the kill step when it's in the water bath.
Oh, okay. So the heat does do some killing when you pour it on the, okay.
It's just from the water bath part where that's where the time at that heat will cause the death.
For that one period of time. And then it's of course refrigerated. Or okay.
Yeah. And then then it's usually left on the shelf until it's opened.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So yeah, because of that kill step in the water bath, now you have a shelf stable product and it's acidified.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And you need the schedule process for that as well. And follow the steps on the schedule process.
Going off of the canning process, I have another question regarding that. So I typically, when I can jams or pickles, I use, just standard ball mason jars. And usually my last step is, sanitizing the lids prior to putting them on. I'm just curious, what's the optimal way to do that? I don't use a sanitizer typically. I just boil the lids for a certain length.
Yeah. You don't even need to boil the lids anymore. They used to tell us to do that, but now they tell us we don't need to boil the lids.
But we still should sanitize them, correct? Or are they just saying don't worry at all?
You don't have to, because I think the heating process in the during the water bath is enough.
Okay.
You only have to sanitize the jars when it's like less than 10 minutes. So I think as long as it's a 10-minute process or greater. then that heat is enough.
Okay, good to know. Thank you.
Wait,
Yeah.
can you clarify the 10-minute?
Yeah,
What's less than 10 minutes?
Yeah, that's what they say. They say less than 10 minutes, you need to sterilize the canning jar, because I guess it's not enough time at the heat. Like I haven't processed anything in less than 10 minutes, so I haven't paid much attention to it. But if you're processing less than 10 minutes, you want to sanitize the jar, because I guess it's not enough heat to be considered.
Should I be doing that for honey jars as well?
For honey, because honey is, yeah, I would say, yeah, because you don't want to introduce things and you're not heating the honey. But I don't know the answer.
Yeah, I
You
mean,
may not need to.
I'll jump in and say that in our facility, when we fill honey products, we don't sanitize the lids or jars prior. They come in clean. They're stored clean in a taped box, and we take them out and use them just as they came.
Okay.
Yeah. And then
Okay,
I
thank you.
also just wanted to add that a lot of products, not including pickles, but a lot of products use the hot fill and hold method. Where we fill a hot liquid like hot sauce, tomato sauce, we fill the hot liquid directly into the jar. And then oftentimes that jar or the bottle, whatever it is, gets inverted for 5 minutes, and that hot liquid sanitizes the headspace. Maybe sanitizes isn't the right word, but essentially heats that space so that there's no opportunity for pathogenic growth. So that is a method that's used for a lot of bottled and jarred products, hot fill and hold. Pickles are a funny category.
Pickle and jam mainly use water bath. And the minimum is like 10 minutes, but to be safe, most people do 15 minutes water bath with the boiling water.
I'm wondering about the shelf life of products. How do you determine how long something can stay on the shelf or in the refrigerator?
That's a good question. In terms of canned goods, they're sort of indefinitely, as long as that seal is tight, it's indefinitely good, but it's going to decrease in quality over time. So it's going to depend on what quality product you want to have on the market. So there's no real answer.
But if I'm considering my salad dressing and I use different methods to lower the pH and water activity, how would I know how long it could stay? Would I have to do a water bath for a salad dressing?
Well, usually for products like that, where you're making an acidified product, probably doing a hot fill and hold methodology, you're going to have to obtain a scheduled process. I was trying to find a link so we can put a link for what that means in the chat, but essentially those types of product, acidified and acid products, water activity controlled products like hot fudges and things like that, they have to go out to a process authority. So process authorities, there's a great one at Cornell. They have the Cornell Food Venture Center. So you submit some paperwork and send them a sample of your product, and they take a look at the parameters and they will establish a preliminary shelf life. Usually for something like that, it's going to be a year. But then you can submit for a shelf life study, which I don't think is very expensive, maybe a couple $100s, and then you can try to extend it to 2 years. And there are industry standards for these things. A lot of the acid and acidified products end up with a 2-year shelf life. Sometimes we see things that end up with even like a 3-year shelf life. Like I think maple syrup products sometimes get a 3-year shelf life.
What kind of shelf life would honey get?
I don't know, to be honest. I'd have to look that up.
I think it'd be up there with maple syrup because it's a high sugar content.
Yeah, low water activity.
Honey, if I may,
go ahead.
As long as honey is sealed tightly and gets no exposure to water, it can last forever. There have been jars found in ancient Egyptian tombs of honey that was still edible.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to wrap that up, I mean, shelf life is generally quality factors over food safety factors. So you're thinking about like, when is it going to change color? When is it going to taste off? When is the consistency going to get weird? So you sort of establish that on your own. But if you're working with a product that needs a scheduled process, then they give you a shelf life and you have to apply to extend it. I will find that link on the Cornell website because they do a great overview of what that means. And I think that'll be relevant to a lot of you.
And I put in the chat that the person in charge needs to have a better process control school training if you do the acidified shelf-stable products. If you're producing it yourself, unless you are using, you know, Kate, or you are using, you know, a lot of people in this room. So otherwise you don't need that. But if you're producing it yourself, you need better process control school training.
All right, I'm linking that now. I'm gonna move us along in a moment here. Any other questions before we wrap up hazards?
Yeah, I just had a quick question. When would a water bath be insufficient and you would need to resume to canning? Is that only in an removing oxygen type of step? So I've developed a cheese sauce that I can can, but it certainly changes the quality of it, and I'd like to just water bath it. I didn't know if there were certain things that you can't water bath and it has to be canned.
You mean canned like hot fill and hold? Like with not
I mean, versus taking jars, putting them in boiling water versus putting it under a canner pressure for 10 degrees at, you know, sea level.
I don't know about cheese. I mean, cheese is, I mean, not acidic enough. If they would, you'd probably need a scheduled process for that. So then they would tell you which way to can it. I don't know about cheese.
You mean the cheese sauce?
Yeah, like an Alfredo or a mac and cheese sauce, something that's milk based.
That needs a retort because the pH is not low enough. Otherwise, it's gonna be curdle. That's also happened with some of like a milk tea that is almost impossible to make it shelf stable with hot fill.
Yeah, and retort is like my understanding of retort processing is retort is like the commercial version of a home pressure canner.
Okay.
Right. It's changing the pressure so you can get the temp of the water higher than typical boiling or the steam, whatever it is. So lots of small manufacturers don't offer that kind of processing. Like our facility doesn't have that. I don't think Commonwealth has that, but a big co-packer, like a traditional co-manufacturer would offer that, but you'd have to be at a scale that it would make sense financially.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff, how we make food shelf stable.
Can I ask another question? So what if we're making stuff just out of our kitchen to sell here on our farm in our farm store and not commercializing it? If we're making like a fresh sauce or a dressing, we just want to put it in a pint container and sit on the shelf for, a week or so.
I mean, generally you can do that and it'll have a 7-day shelf life according to the food code.
Okay.
That's my understanding. Okay.
And if you don't claim the shelf stable, like a shelf stable, you don't need scheduled process. It's gonna be like refrigerated or something like that, and that's directly to consumers.
Yeah, direct to consumer is generally so much easier. Any kind of retail establishment. Wholesale is where the enforcement of some of these more strict regulations comes into play. So we'll talk about that. I'm going to jump in. We have till 11 for the next section, and it's a lot to get through. So let me go ahead. I'm in charge of the next section. So let me share my screen here. Everybody can see this. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, we can see it.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks, needed the confirmation. Okay, so this is module 6, food safety management. So in this section, we're going to be talking about the pertinent regulations to food manufacturers like you all. So we'll talk about the different government bodies that regulate different types of products. We're going to talk about the Food Safety Modernization Act of 2011 and the Preventive Controls Rule, which will be applicable to many of you. And we'll talk about good manufacturing practices or GMPs and what is required there. And then generally what it means to put together a food safety plan. So what implementing the preventive controls looks like when you're putting pen to paper. So this is sort of this is just a secondary slide on the overview of this section. Who regulates what products? What is HACCP? I'm betting many of you are familiar with the HACCP framework, hazard analysis and critical control points, which is similar but a little bit different from the preventive controls framework. So we'll talk about both of those. We'll talk about how they differ. In reality, they have a lot in common. And then we'll talk about what it means to actually implement preventive controls by creating a food safety plan. What are the benefits to a food safety program? I think a lot of people's minds really go first to regulatory requirements. So what is going to be required of me? How can I legally make this product, and what do I have to do in order to do so? But we always list safe food product first. So we are here to encourage you to be thinking about food safety, like I said, early and often, and incorporating practices into your production facility so that you're minimizing any kind of hazards that could arise. You're thinking about those things now so you don't have to react to them later. Ultimately, you want to create a product that's, high quality, consistent, and safe every time you manufacture it. You want to be able to react to issues quickly. And so when you have systems in place for how you're going to deal with those, it's easy to react should they come up. And that in turn minimizes your potential for having to ever recall a product. And we'll talk about the different categories of recalls based on the different types of hazards. By thinking about food safety now, as you're kind of at the beginning of launching a new food venture, you're going to create efficiencies in your kitchen and your manufacturing space because you're incorporating those food safety steps into the production process rather than thinking about them as an additional piece or an additional step, which will in turn lead to higher quality and higher yield products. This bullet here on buyer requirements is really important. So some of you are going to be exempt based on business size. You're going to be exempt from some of the regulations that I'll talk about in a minute, but more and more we are seeing buyers actually dictate what is required of their producers. And sometimes what they require is stricter than what you have to comply with regulation wise. And so we've been seeing that a lot with our clients with Whole Foods. Technically, small businesses don't necessarily have to comply with some of the regulation, but Whole Foods is asking for demonstration of that information. So in short, it's wise to be thinking about it now and incorporating these practices into the process from the beginning. And then that last bullet, of course, consumer satisfaction and adverse publicity. You want to do your best to protect your brand. And so not having issues come up with your brand is going to help your business in the long run. Okay, so as far as the regulatory bodies that cover different products, so I'm going to just say the acronyms, though I'm sure you guys are familiar with these groups. The USDA, or the United States Department of Agriculture, regulates meat, poultry, and egg products. Egg products is any egg that's no longer in the shell, like a liquid or a powder egg. And the FDA pretty much regulates everything else, so the Food and Drug Administration. So most of what y'all are talking about today, any kind of jarred or canned products, is going to be regulated by the FDA. And that includes some of these other things I think they're less relevant, but supplements, bottled water, additives, and then infant formula. And then I also just here wanted to mention that we have a lot of Massachusetts people in the room. The Mass Food Protection Program, or it's a program of the Department of Health, they're often going to be the body that is coming in to do an inspection in your facility. So they're really the one kind of enforcing the regulation. And like I said, a lot of that comes up when you move and transition to wholesale sales. They have a lot of really great information on their website, a lot of resources. So a good place to visit. This slide just depicts, so we often are referencing the Code of Federal Regulations. And so this depicts where in the code you can find information for each of these products. So you can see the numbers there underneath each different type of product. I will say the code itself can be challenging to read. It's all written in legalese, but it is a good place to at least start. And then the FDA and the USDA do a really good job of putting out sort of Q&A style documents where they break down some of what they're saying in the code. The code dictates that juice products, seafood products, and meat and poultry products comply with the HACCP framework and have HACCP plans, whereas pretty much everything else falls under the preventive controls rule and having to complete a food safety plan. So we'll talk about that. And you can see the low acid foods are pulled out here, and there's some specific code written for those items. So that's like the green beans and the canned green beans or the canned cheese products that are a little bit more complicated and often require some kind of more sophisticated style of processing. So I'm assuming lots of you are familiar with HACCP. HACCP stands for Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points, and it is a framework for implementing food safety programming in your manufacturing facility. It's a way of looking at hazards and controlling them. And it was actually developed in 1959 as a way to make sure that food going into space was safe, and then was expanded from there to a nationwide program. Before the Food Safety Modernization Act, it's my understanding that almost all foods fell under HACCP, and it sounds like some people have written HACCP plans for their products. And then in 2011, with the Food Safety Modernization Act, we moved some products to no longer having to put together HACCP plans, but instead having to put together food safety plans, which reflect the preventive controls. There are 7 principles within the HACCP framework, but those kind of break down into what I like to describe as sort of 2 phases. So the first phase being a hazard analysis. And we asked you to complete some homework prior to class, which was coming up with a product description, as well as creating a process flow diagram. And that process flow diagram is going to be your best tool when it comes to completing your hazard analysis. So that is looking at each step of the process, from receiving ingredients to processing to packing and distribution, and identifying the points in the process where a hazard could arise. So thinking about things like ingredients that might not have been refrigerated, or something that needed to be cooked that wasn't cooked long enough. And then the second phase there, that risk management, includes all of these other steps. So that's really identifying the points in the process that you and your team need to be thinking about most critically, so you can establish critical limits for your processing steps to make sure that those hazards don't arise. And to try to make that less abstract, an example would be receiving eggs for your cookie and refrigerating them and making sure that they're received at the right temp and then stored at the right temp. Another critical point, and therefore critical limit, might be the cook step, making sure that you are cooking the cookie, the batter, the dough, for the right amount of time at the correct temperature. And we look to scientific research to demonstrate to us what those need to be, what those parameters need to be. Monitoring and record keeping are always really important. So you have your hazard analysis, or you have your HACCP plan, that's your policy, that's on paper for your team to reference. But then you do need to establish secondary documents where you're monitoring all of the activities that you've established as important. So your team might be out on the production floor and they have a clipboard, and on that clipboard is a checklist of things that you have identified as important and that they need to be marking as they're doing the production process. Taking temperatures, marking times, etc. Checking off that things happened according to plan, so that when you're meeting with an inspector or participating in a third-party audit, you have all of that down to document that you did it the way you said you were going to do it. And that's that verification piece. And the validation piece has to do with looking to research to prove that the parameters that we have set are the appropriate parameters based on evidence. So I mentioned the preventive controls rule. In 2011, we saw the Food Safety Modernization Act, and a few years later, we saw the Preventive Controls Rule, which essentially establishes that food manufacturers have to create food safety plans for their products. Good manufacturing practices were a part of the Food Safety Modernization Act, but have been around, I think, since like the 60s maybe, or 70s. And we'll talk more about the different levels of good manufacturing practices and what that looks like in a food manufacturing facility. But essentially what's required as a part of the Preventive Controls Rule is good manufacturing practices, food safety plans, as well as employee training. So the Preventive Controls Rule is, like I said, very similar to the HACCP framework. It's just another framework for applying food safety practices in your facility. So the first step looks very much the same. It's a risk assessment. It's looking at your process flow diagram and coming up with the points in that process that could pose a hazardous time or a hazardous issue. And then the risk management is essentially just an expanded version of those critical control points and critical limits. So preventive controls actually establishes 4 different ways in which we can control hazards in our process. So the first is process controls. These are things that we're doing throughout the course of the processing to make sure that the product is made safely. So a great example of that would be cooking your cookie. It's the kill step. We talked about allergens, and we talked about allergens as a chemical hazard. So an allergen control generally has to do with keeping allergenic products separate from non-allergenic products and ingredients, and then proper labeling and storage. Sanitation controls are really important when we're talking about ready-to-eat products that don't have a kill step. So I think someone at one point mentioned sofrito, and I know that sofrito is often something that we don't hot fill and hold. We keep it treat it like a fresh and ready-to-eat product that is refrigerated. And so then in your kitchen, your sanitation practices, which are a part of your good manufacturing practices, are going to be a really important control in making sure that biological hazards don't occur. And then supplier controls have to do with the ingredients that are going into your product. So making sure that you're confident that your suppliers are also creating ingredients that are safe. So sometimes people will implement supplier programs in which they're requiring certain documentation from their suppliers to verify that the ingredients are safe every time, and they collect those and hold them on file and have them should they need them for an inspection or an audit. So what's the difference between the two frameworks, the HACCP and the preventive controls framework? They are very similar. Like I said, preventive controls is really an expanded way of controlling the potential hazards that could arise based on those 4 different processes, rather than just establishing critical limits for critical control points. Both frameworks are all about prevention rather than reacting to a problem after it occurs. So like I said, with FSMA, we saw the preventive controls rule come into place called Preventive Controls for Human Food. And you can see the relevant code there if you want to go ahead and dig into it more. But there are really 3 required components of the rule. The first is employee training, having an established employee training program for your facility. And making sure that whoever is putting together your food safety plan has been established as a preventive controls qualified individual, which does mean going to a training. They're hosted regularly by lots of the extension programs. I know UMass Amherst does one generally at least once a year. The rule also says that your facility has to have current good manufacturing practices, often just referred to as good manufacturing practices. And we're going to go through the different subsections of what that looks like in the next few slides. But the meat of it is that facilities have to comply with the preventive controls rule and therefore do that by creating a food safety plan. And so what that looks like is conducting your hazard analysis, to identify known and reasonably foreseeable hazards like the 3 we identified in our first section, the biological, chemical, and physical. And then from there, identifying the hazards that need preventive controls, and then coming up with the preventive controls for each of those steps. And we're gonna, in our final section, I believe today, practice that together so you can see what that looks like on paper. And coming up with corrective actions should someone on your team not follow the protocol. And again, record keeping all the time. So as far as compliance goes, it technically, very small businesses do not have to comply with the preventive controls rule. They do not have to write food safety plans. We're really here to encourage you to be thinking about preventive controls and hazard analysis anyway. And I would really say that it's wise to create a food safety plan, regardless of whether or not it's required of you, because it's going to help your business. And it's very possible that a buyer is going to dictate you need one down the line anyway, like I said. But technically, very small businesses do not have to comply with the rule. What that means, and you can see the asterisk at the bottom of the slide here, that means a business averaging less than 1 million in sales annually. There's another part to the rule which allows for exemption, which is for folks that are doing sales, the majority of their sales direct to consumer in some kind of retail establishment and have less than $500,000 in sales on a 3-year average. There'll be more information about that in the resources that we send you. So there are exemptions for very small businesses. It's likely that all of you represent very small businesses. However, you're not totally off the hook. You still have to provide evidence of exemption to the FDA. And what that means is filing a biannual attestation. If you want to know what that looks like, you can go right ahead and Google it, and right away that comes up on the FDA website. You have to create an account and file your attestation to say, I am noting that I am exempt as a very small business from this rule, and you have to keep up with that every other year. You still have to comply with the other 2 subparts of the preventive controls rule. So you still have to do employee training. You still have to have a PCQI and you still have to have good manufacturing practices for your facility. The last bullet here, in the case that you are participating in an inspections, you still have to be able to demonstrate that you understand what the hazards are in your process. So it's still a very worthwhile exercise to create your process flow diagram and do a hazard analysis with your team, because those questions are going to be asked of you during your wholesale inspection or during an inspection with the FDA. So you have to be able to demonstrate that you at least understand what the critical points are in the process and what you would do in the case that something should arise. Okay, so really the meat of the preventive controls rule is creating a food safety plan. And again, we're going to practice the hazard analysis and the preventive controls in the final two sections today, so that you can really see what that looks like. But the food safety plan is essentially a set of written documents. It's based on food safety principles, and it incorporates those two phases, the hazard analysis and the preventive controls. A part of your preventive controls might be a supply chain program where you're looking at your suppliers and establishing parameters for them to make sure, like I said, you're receiving safe ingredients every time. And we'll also talk about a recall plan, which is sort of framed as part of the food safety plan. I think of it more as a part of the food safety program. The recall plan is more helpful as a separate document. And that's what you refer to in the case that you do need to recall a batch of your product. But first, employee training and good manufacturing practices. So as a part of the preventive controls rule, like I said, you do have to have an employee training program in place. You have to train your employees in hygienic practices. So what it is that they need to do in order to be safe and as an employee, including things like, human hygiene, hand washing, what they need to wear on the job. Are we, wearing hair nets, beard nets? What kind of clothing needs to be worn on the floor? All of that should be incorporated into some kind of annual training framework for your facility. And that, there's no framework on that. That could be a weekly training, a monthly training. Maybe you do a full day annual training for your staff. But you do need to be educating them on the expectations, and you do need to have a policy around that. And this responsibility, of course, falls on the supervisor of the kitchen. We talk a lot about trying to create food safety culture in manufacturing operations. So really encouraging your employees to be a part of the food safety planning process. So as you're writing food safety plans, encourage people who are boots on the ground, people on the floor making the product, to be a part of that process. And you want to encourage people to, make recommendations for new processes as ideas come to them. You want to encourage them to stay home if they're sick. You want to encourage them to call things out as they see them. If sanitation processes aren't being followed properly, to say something about it. And you want very much to encourage all of your employees to identify any issues with the product or the process prior to your product leaving the facility. And this, we can have all different kinds of systems for this. Some facilities have a morning meeting every day, or a Friday morning meeting once a week, where people can bring issues or ideas. Other folks have like a suggestion box where people can leave an anonymous idea that they're thinking about or issue that they noticed. It really depends on the culture of your facility. So I think probably some of you are familiar with the concept of good manufacturing practices. Good manufacturing practices are essentially the way that you're keeping your facility clean and safe. So they are standard operating procedures and sanitation standard operating procedures related to food safety, and have a lot to do with how you keep your facility clean. And they support the development of a safe food product, of course. These are some of the aspects that fall under good manufacturing practices. So we have employee hygiene, the condition of your plant and your grounds, so the surrounding area, the parking lot, the grass, the space outside of your facility, sanitary facilities, equipment and utensils, as well as sanitary operations. And we're going to dig into each of those. So personal hygiene is really important. And it's, people usually establish some kind of protocol in the beginning, but it's really important to circle back to that and continue training on it, which could also include like signage and reminders for folks who are coming in every day and start to forget about these things. This section of the GMPs is required of all facilities. So anybody who employs food manufacturing staff has to have employee hygiene practices established and written down. And they include some of these bullets here. So anybody who is sick should not be on the floor working with food, of course. Any kind of, cuts or lesions on the body should be covered. Personal cleanliness is, something that is, it has to be in your policy. Hand washing, of course, restraining hair, as well as beards with hair nets and beard nets, and then removing any kind of jewelry that could potentially like fall into a batch of your product. I think a lot of these things are things you're probably thinking about. They're pretty straightforward, but they are required to be a part of your policy. And therefore you have to train on them. And you can see the relevant code there. Feel free to unmute and jump in for this activity, but what are some of the things that you think this employee is doing correctly on the processing floor?
He's wearing a hairnet.
Mm-hmm.
He has a beard net on too.
Yep. Anything else?
Clean lab coat.
Yeah.
Safety glasses.
Yeah, great. Oh my gosh, that's awesome. You got all of them. So he's wearing clothing that's designated for the processing floor. And he, in all likelihood, although it's kind of hard to see, has those glasses secured to his head so that they also cannot fall off.
Do the glasses pose any kind of risk of contamination? Like, where did those glasses come from?
That's a good question. I would say not necessarily. The biggest thing that we talk about with glasses is that they're secured to the body so they can't become a foreign object in the food product.
Yeah, that makes sense.
They shouldn't have any contact with food.
Thanks.
Yep. One thing before I move on to just note is that it is important that people have designated clothing that they're wearing on the processing floor, whether that's covering this, the clothing that they wore in, or if there's something they can change into. Same goes for shoes. So the second section for the good manufacturing is having clean plants and grounds. So ensuring that there's no way that pests are going to be attracted to your facility is really what this boils down to. So this might include keeping grass cut. It might include keeping any kind of like greenery or growth from growing up the side of your building. It involves proper drainage, both outside the plant, so you don't have standing water, as well as inside as a part of your sanitation, cleaning and sanitation practices. Having good systems for waste disposal, so waste isn't sitting around, and that might be done in-house, or you might contract with an outside contractor for that, depending on the scale of your facility. Ensuring all other surfaces, other than work surfaces remain clean as well. So floors, walls, ceilings. Essentially, there shouldn't be places into which we could have any kind of food or liquid product getting stuck and having growth there. Providing adequate lighting and ventilation. So, lighting so that we're able to clean properly, and ventilation so we have good airflow. And then, of course, any openings like windows or doors should be covered with a screen or have a closing door to prevent any kind of pests from entering. So we think about chipmunks and squirrels and mice and things that could get into your facility and tamper with ingredients or finished product. And then we also, of course, think about bugs. Most plants end up implementing some kind of pest management program, and that can be done in-house through regular visual inspections, or there is always an option to contract with an outside group to do your pest management. So fun exercise, which building is better and why? Anybody know?
Left.
Mm-hmm. How come?
It is free of vines.
The one with the vines is like making a path for the pest to crawl onto the building.
Exactly, right? So a place that pests could, we might have bugs living in there. We might have little critters that use it as a way to climb up and sneak into the window. So the next section is sanitary facilities and controls. So within this section, you are required to have safe and potable water, adequate plumbing, including backflow, proper sewage, and like we talked about, a plan for rubbish disposal, and then proper hand washing and toilet facilities. Anybody got an idea of what's wrong with this picture?
Well, it's a perfectly adequate picture, but yeah, the drainage is apparently inadequate.
Yes, great, thank you. Inadequate drainage. Thanks for bearing with these dorky examples. I really appreciate it. So as you can see, all liquids aren't draining out. We have some like extraneous matter stuck in there. So that should have been removed as a part of the cleaning process. This is creating a harborage point for biological concerns as well as pests. Next section of the GMPs is equipment and utensils. So this is making sure that any of like the small wares that you're using in your facility are easy to keep clean and are well maintained, and so are being replaced if anything cracks or breaks. And then food contact surfaces, as well as the smallwares themselves, should be corrosion resistant and made of non-toxic materials. So often we're talking about metal. They should have smooth seams so as not to create harborage points for bacteria. And we should always be thinking about allergen cross contact and cleaning and sanitation, which we'll talk about in a minute. This is slide 2 if you're just continuing with the equipment and utensils. Freezers, as any cold storage that you have in your facility, should always be fitted with a thermometer, and you should be able to monitor the temperature over time. And then any instruments that you're using, like you might have a pH meter, you might have thermometers, some facilities have a water activity meter, folks doing jams might have a Brix meter. Those should always be clean, maintained, stored properly, and regularly calibrated. So you might be using some of those as controls in your food food safety plan process. And so in order to be sure that those controls are implemented properly, the equipment we're using has to be maintained and calibrated. So sanitary operations, next section of the GMPs, your facility must be maintained in a clean and sanitary position. So what that looks like is proper storage and labeling of any toxic materials. So that includes any kind of sanitizers that you're using to sanitize spaces in the facility, as well as, generally just storage and labeling are important for everything that's in the facility. So this includes allergens, chemicals. Things should be kept in separate spaces as much as possible. Establishing pest control practices, like we talked about, that can be done in-house or contracted out. And then sanitation of both food contact surfaces and non-food contact surfaces. So prevention of allergen cross contact, and generally storing, any kind of portable equipment, small wares in a clean and dry space after production. We talk a lot about cleaning and sanitizing. I always think that this is straightforward, but just to reiterate it in case it's not, cleaning as its own act is the physical removal of soil and debris from a surface using soap and water. Sanitizing is a secondary step. So sanitizing cannot happen until cleaning has happened. So first we clean any small wares, equipment, work surfaces. Once they're clean and rinsed, then the sanitation step can happen. And that reduces or eliminates any microorganisms to a food safe level using generally chemicals, but maybe also heat. And yes, surfaces must be cleaned before they can be sanitized. In our facility, because we're a shared use space making different kinds of products, we do a pre-op cleaning and sanitation, and then we do a post-op cleaning and sanitation. And one thing I'll mention here is that the GMPs, which we're walking through now, or walking through some of the sections of the GMPs, that's sort of the minimum standard for cleanliness. And you as a facility owner are always welcome to go above that and implement additional practices as well. I'm going to skip this one for the sake of time. This is just to reiterate that it's really important to break down equipment as much as you possibly can after production when you're doing your cleaning and sanitizing. There was a great but horrible example of an outbreak in 2000 that happened with a slicer at I believe it was a deli. So this was being like well cleaned, or so they thought, every day. However, there was a salmonella outbreak that tracked back to this facility, and it's because they weren't actually taking the equipment apart. And so there was a buildup of organic debris under the carriage, under the handles, and there was a bacterial growth in that space that they had no idea about. So it's not always possible to take every piece of equipment apart in its entirety, but you should really try to do the best that you can to try and decrease these harborage points, to clean these harborage points. In a big manufacturing facility with an established line to make one product, they would have some kind of clean in place program, or the equipment itself is flushed without having to be taken apart. But generally, small manufacturers, the cleaning and sanitation process takes a bit longer because we're, using things that maybe aren't used regularly, smallwares, and they are, have to be taken apart before they can be cleaned. So a pain in the butt, but an important step. Okay, just wrapping up the GMPs, I would encourage you to go look at the code and kind of read through all that is required as a part of the GMPs on your own. That was just sort of the quick overview. But it's important that every food production facility have good manufacturing practices in place. When you do an inspection with the state, that is something that they are going to look at. This is the way that this is something that they're always going to enforce. You have to train your employees on the GMPs that you established. And again, just like reiterating, it's not trying to create a culture of, it's not because I told you so, but rather this is why we're doing this. These are some of the things that could happen should we not implement these practices. And also I encourage you to be a part of the planning process and come up with new ideas or new ways of doing things as a part of the team. And then posting reminders around the facility is always helpful. And I find it helpful to replace those often, since people stop noticing things that have been up for a while. So new signage kind of regularly can be a helpful thing for your processing staff and your team. And that might be hand washing reminders, notices about what they're supposed to be wearing in their locker room or changing space. And then again, having periodic check-ins or reminder sessions once a week in the morning, whatever that looks like for your team based on how often you're producing and how much turnover you have. Ultimately, GMPs are the required building block for all food safety management. So they are the starting place, and we often look to our GMPs in our preventive controls. So if you don't have them, start thinking about them. Okay, I'm actually going to pause here before I dig into what it means to put together a food safety plan, just to see if people have questions. Okay, I'm going to keep plugging away then. So again, we talked about preventive controls as a rule of the Food Safety Modernization Act, and what that shakes down to on paper is the creation of a food safety plan. So the food safety plan is where we house these two different steps, the hazard analysis and the implementation of preventive controls. Usually the recall plan, like I said, is a separate document, but it's a part of your food safety program. Generally, what we see in the food safety plan itself is your product or process description, which you've worked on, your flow diagram, a hazard analysis, and then preventive controls for those hazardous points, and a system for record keeping. And we are going to walk through a hazard analysis and preventive controls in the final two sections. So this is the big picture overview. Recall planning is super important. And before we even talk about creating a recall plan, we really need to be thinking about traceability. So how are you as a manufacturer tracing which batches of product are going where to what buyers, so that in the case of a recall, you're able to get those products back and destroy them. So some people use their, financial software like QuickBooks for that. Other folks invest in, some other kind of software. For the most part, it's in my experience, small businesses use Excel spreadsheets or Google Sheets to track which batches are going where. And in traceability, it is required that you trace one step forward and one step back. So the one step forward is where your finished batches are being sold. And the one step back is what ingredients are going into each of your batches. So in the case that let's say you're making hot sauce, and your hot sauce includes vinegar from a vinegar supplier. Your vinegar supplier calls and says, there was an issue with this batch of our product, and we know that you purchased it. And you know that you're able to see, oh, we used that lot code of vinegar, that batch code of that vinegar in this batch of our product. So that's the one step backward. So you do need to be tracking both of those things, and can very much start by doing that in a spreadsheet. There's some good examples and templates out there. And then the recall plan is sort of the next part of that. So this is your plan for should something go awry, should a store call and say, a customer brought back your product and here was the problem. This is your established process for recalling that product, for getting it back to your facility. So it includes the the people on your team, and it includes each of the duties that they're going to be responsible for. So in the case of a serious recall, like who is notifying, the local media, who's responsible for alerting stores and consumers. And then the goal is to swiftly recover as much product as possible and destroy it. Hopefully nobody ever has to do this, but important to have a plan just in case. So recalls are important because they prevent unnecessary consumer illness. So should someone get sick from your product, the idea is to recall everything else that's out there back so that nobody else gets sick or even dies. It's a way to protect your brand. So should something go wrong, it's better that we have, one scenario where someone got sick and not be unable to recall product and not control that issue growing into a bigger problem. And of course, to minimize any civil or criminal actions against your business. And then I think Nicole mentioned this earlier, but some of the causes we see for recalls, big one is undeclared allergens on food product labels, cross contamination or microorganisms in the food, foreign objects. So that's an example of a physical hazard. Chemical contamination. So someone mentioned pesticides. This might be like, using sanitizers that ended up in the food. Packaging defects, and then labeling errors. And there's different classifications of recalls. I think, yes, that's here. So the lowest one there, the class 3 recall, is the recall we hope to have. There's not going to be any adverse health consequences like the labeling example. We put the wrong weight or volume on our label. You do have to recall it. You have to bring it back and fix it, but it's not going to hurt anybody. So that's classified as a class 3. And in your plan, you'll have a different approach for each class of recall. And obviously you'll be taking more steps more quickly and probably notifying more people the more serious the recall. So class 2 is the remote probability of an adverse health consequence. And so an example there would be something like norovirus. Whereas class 1 is the one we would be most concerned about. There's reasonable concern for a public health hazard, illness, or death. And some examples of this are botulism in a canned good, salmonella, or undeclared allergen. So not noting that there's dairy or that there's gluten in your product, and the concern that, someone who had a serious allergy to that would buy it and eat it. So again, just to recap, the recall plan is a document in which you establish your policies and procedures for recalling product should you be made aware of an issue with your product. It tends to be a separate document, but is part of your food safety program. And traceability is a part of that. So coming up with good systems for traceability are important. The food safety plan itself, again, we talked a little bit about this, but the best place to start is with a product and process description. So getting really clear on what it is you're making. And then from there, creating a process flow diagram, which is going to ultimately help you with your hazard analysis. And so this is a walkthrough of every step of the process, starting with receiving ingredients to processing to, how you're storing it and distributing it. There's not a mandatory format for this, but it's an important part of the process. It's for your benefit to help make the planning process easier. We looked at this in the beginning. This is a sample of a product description. It is also important to come up with a process description, so separate from your product description. So for each step in the process, you are explaining what it is that has to happen. So this is helpful for your team, and it'll be helpful for you when you're doing your hazard analysis to think about what could go wrong. It's just, an increase of detail. And here's an example of what a process flow diagram looks like. So there's lots of good examples out there. And you can see in the top left, we start with receiving our refrigerated ingredients, eggs and butter, alert, alert, there could be a hazard there, storing, and then mixing, forming, freezing, etc. So what's next? Hazard analysis is the basis for your food safety plan. So you can't come up with ways to address potential problems until you've identified the points in the process where a hazard might arise and what that would look like. So you have to determine for each step in the process, does that step introduce a potential food safety hazard? are we going to control the hazard at that point? And we'll talk about that in our preventive, in the section on preventive controls, what that decision-making process looks like. Again, just an example of what the hazard analysis process will or could look like. I mean, you saw this in the food safety template that we shared ahead of time, but you can see we're looking at that first step there, the ingredient processing step, receiving ingredients, eggs and butter. So then we look to that next column. Are there potential hazards? And we break that down by category of hazard: biological, chemical, and physical. So it's possible that we would be concerned about a biological hazard of salmonella here, and we'll control that by proper storage, temperature. And then we're also, of course, concerned about chemical hazards or allergens, eggs and milk for our cookie product. So the second step of the food safety plan process is your preventive controls. So we've talked a lot about this, but once you've determined the hazards, it's time to determine if they require a preventive control. I spoke about this briefly earlier, but there are 4 categories of preventive controls, and we'll get some more practice with this later. But again, we have a process preventive control, allergen preventive control, sanitation preventive control, and supply chain preventive controls. So lots of different ways in which we control potential hazards. And so you'll do some decision making once you've established your hazards as to how you're going to control them. And so again, this is that expanded version as opposed to the critical control points and HACCP model. Let's just do this all together for the sake of time. We'll just look at question 1 here. This is an activity. So as far as controls in your operation go, if we're thinking about our chocolate chip cookie, what is one potential control in the chocolate chip cookie, and what category would it fall under? Does anybody have an idea?
Well, one control would be the baking, correct?
Correct. Yep. So the baking, and do you have any sense of what category that would fall into?
Oh God. Spacing at the moment. Apologies.
No, it's okay. So that would be anybody else?
Process, right? Process preventative.
Yeah. So that would be a process preventive control. It happens as a part of the production process. It's a kill step essentially. Okay, I'm gonna keep moving along just for the sake of time. So just really, we wanted to emphasize the importance of record keeping as a part of your food safety planning process, as a part of your good manufacturing practices. There's no like standard for how you're required to do this. You are allowed to have computerized records. You can also keep paper records. Record keeping should be limited to authorized individuals, people who have been, part of the development of your procedures and are trained on what needs to be done. And if you do have floor staff who are doing the monitoring and record keeping during the production day, they should be reviewed at the end of the day by a trained individual. And this is just an example of what record keeping can include. So, what the record is, date and time, your facility, et cetera. I'm going to skip this one. Okay, so next steps for your operation, we're wrapping up. First and foremost, determine which governing body regulates your product. Is it FDA or USDA? And then depending on the product type, are there other things you need to be thinking about? So we talked about acidified foods and scheduled processes earlier. So if you are making an acidified food, for example, you do have to also have Better Process Control School certification. Which is not a big deal, but just something that you have to have. And we can link what that looks like in the chat. And then determine preventive controls requirements. So do you need to put together a food safety plan, or are you exempt? You likely are all exempt, but it's a worthwhile process anyway, and it might be required review by a buyer down the line. Ensuring that your facility has established good manufacturing practices, that they are written down on paper and regularly updated, and that they're followed by your whole staff. And so your staff needs to be trained on that process. And then thinking about developing a recall plan for your operation. It's very helpful to regularly, even once a year, do a mock recall. So even just pretending that there was something wrong with one batch, you can come up with whatever fun example you want to come up with, and then seeing if your team can recall that product. Where did it all go? How are we going to get it back? Okay. We're a little bit over time. Sorry, team. Are there any quick questions before we take a break?
There was one question in the chat about what procedure for products that you grow yourself, or what is the procedure for products that you grow yourself so you don't have any sort of paper trail? Or maybe if you don't.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think what we're thinking about or talking about there is a supplier verification step. So if like you're unable to trace like the lot code or something, what we have often done for any kind of like fresh cut or frozen product is we have looked to on-farm food safety practices. So can that farm demonstrate that they're practicing, you know, good food safety? It's likely that, you know, farms are often GAP or in Massachusetts Commonwealth quality certified. So that could work in that case.
Well, yeah, I asked that question. One of the hiccups I encountered over this past summer when I was exploring all of this was that it was told to me that, you know, I need to somehow provide documentation of the produce, all the products I'm using in my jams. And it was stressing me that I need to like essentially somehow buy my own produce and therefore have a record of it, which struck me as kind of absurd, but I wasn't quite sure what to do about it.
No, I think you can demonstrate.
Can I answer that one?
Please do, yeah.
So you can create your own paper trail. That means you can certify whatever you are producing, right? So when you call for certification from the state, which is the Commonwealth quality, you are listing all the vegetables you were producing. They go over and they check what you were doing there, you know, and then they will give you the certification that you were aiming for. And if you're not aiming for that, you don't need to, but you can create your own paper tray and say, this is how I harvest my raspberries by hand. They're put in a tote, and then they're like, you create your own paper trail. That way, if something happens, you can step back to the field.
Okay, so when I can basically, at the end of my strawberry harvesting, create a document stating how many in pounds, let's say, how many pounds of strawberries I collected, what day, sign it, and how it was collected.
Yes,
okay.
Indeed.
Now, since I'm doing all this on a very small scale, is that even strictly necessary? I intend basically to sell at farmers markets at this stage of production.
I'd say it's safe to, you know.
Sure.
So if you harvest strawberries, usually here they harvest at least like twice a week. That's the least they harvest. I don't know about your conditions, but you would, let's say, create a log, you know, I harvest on Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Gotcha.
And it doesn't matter, you're just gonna know, you know, like how many pounds, and you freeze all together, and then you have a processing day. So it doesn't matter how, you know, like how many days you harvest, if you're freezing them before you're processing them, but you know that those batches, they were harvesting different days. You have the basic information to trace back to your field. And if you ever have any problem, you can say, well, maybe it was this day, you know, like you can step back, just like the traceability exercise with food safety at the farm. It's like you want to trace back to the field you harvest, because sometimes the problem is a specific field.
Sure. Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, I think let's hold any other questions for now, just because I went a little over. And let's break until 11:25, just so folks can take a break, grab some food, coffee, whatever. And we'll come back at 11:25 and jump into hazard analysis. Sound good?
Sounds good.
Okay. Welcome back, everybody. We did have a couple of people, it looks like, join. I see a Pete and a Jerry and a Kate. If you guys want to unmute and tell us where you're coming from and what your food product is, that might be nice as people trickle in.
I'll go first. My name's Kate McGoldrick. I'm on a little incubator farm in Beverly. I have a veggie production background, but me and my partner have been getting more into herbs, culinary and medicinal, and we're looking to make some products, tea blends and stuff like that. So
cool. Thank you. Welcome. Anybody else new? New to the room?
Hi, good morning.
Hi, Jerry.
Hi, I am Darwin Cruz. I am Darwin Jerry Cruz. I am working with Nuestras Raíces Farm, de Holyoke, Massachusetts. It's a very interesting conference.
Great. Well, thanks for being here.
Okay, yes, thank you.
All right, I think we're going to jump in. We have 2 more sections to cover before 1, and then we'll do a short wrap up. I think, Ploy, you have the next section.
Yep. I will try to make it within the time. So module 7 is hazard analysis. So the goal is to introduce the steps for completing an effective hazard analysis and the process for determining preemptive control implementation. And this is a reminder that food safety is different from food quality. When talking about food safety hazards, we are focusing on the ones that have a likelihood of causing harm to consumers, while things like dirt, dust, or spoilage organisms are undesirable in a product, they are not considered hazards. And hazard analysis focuses on food safety concerns, not the food quality concerns. So we are not going to go over the, what types of hazards, because Nicole already mentioned that in the early section already. So conducting a hazard analysis may seem daunting. There are many potential hazards that can be found in ingredients and processing steps. However, by systematically breaking the process into 6 steps, it's easier to identify hazards and their control measures. The following 6 steps here should be completed for each processing step identifying in your food flow diagram. And when you start a hazard analysis, the best thing you can do is to list every step in making your food product. A good way to do this is an organized fashion is by making a process flow diagram. And Kate showed this diagram before in the early sessions. This is a visual example of a process flow diagram. Think through this step carefully, as this is a fundamental step to create an effective hazard analysis. And this is kind of like, you will see that there is like the number here. So it's always great to have the number listed for each item in the flow. So that way it's more organized. As Kate mentioned, that you need to start from receiving the ingredients until the end. So not just randomly start the process. So just from the beginning, because you never know what is, the hazard might come up. So for hazard analysis, we will be using a cookie example again, as everyone here is familiar with the steps. So the first step in completing a hazard analysis is to list all the processing steps. This step is like making a grocery list by including everything you need on the list. You won't forget about anything later on in the process. Without a list, you are more likely to forget steps, which can lead to food safety risk. So this is the first step. If you have made a process flow diagram already, this is a step already completed. So you can just easily add in all the steps into the first column. And then after that, for example, this is the first processing step is to receiving refrigerated ingredients, which are eggs and butter. And just so you know, because this is only egg and butter, is refrigerated ingredients. So the other, the second item, if you go back to this, is would be receiving shelf-stable ingredients. So it's gonna be a different line. Receiving packaging and labels is gonna be a different line. So the first thing is receiving refrigerated ingredients, eggs, and butter. And then after that, column number 2, step 2, identify potential food safety hazards introduced, control or enhance at this step. So hazards are broken out into 3 categories: biological B, chemical C, and physical P. And then when identifying potential hazards, there are 2 main places to focus. Historical data. Historical data can give information about known hazards for ingredients, processing steps. By looking at these recalls, you can find errors that other processors have made and avoid making them yourself. Scientific literature and resources from this class can also be helpful in both cases. Information has been compiled to help you save time for researching for it yourself. FDA guideline, also a great resource as well. Ask for help. There are few ways to contact food safety experts. We have so many in this room to help with the specific questions. This also includes extension specialists, regulators, and food safety consultants. We will all will be able to help you in different capacities and also at the different cost, but they should be able to help answer technical questions. So now we are, step 2 here is the hazard analysis. And then, so for the biological hazard, we have vegetative pathogens such as Salmonella. And then for C is the chemical hazard, which is actually allergen. We have egg and milk. And for the physical, we have none. So this is how we fill out. And then once hazards are identified, the second part for this step is to determine if they are introduced, controlled, or enhanced. And then for introduced is new ingredients, for example, allergens, potential pathogens. For control is processing steps, cooking, freezing, acidifying, or even storage conditions, separations of allergens, refrigeration, frozen storage. And then the enhanced is the ingredient addition. So high salt concentrations can inhibit some bacterial growth, but allow, so all processing steps that, so anything that will enhance that. If that hazard play a role in the step include, is not controlled there, like it technically, you have a grocery list that will help you remind if you will not forget it in the later step. And then step number 3 is determine if the hazard requires a preventive control. And then once you identify that, you will see if the hazard actually requires that preventive control. So before we go to identify that, some cases it may not require the preventive control, as Kate and Nicole mentioned, that because certain GMP actually already cover that part. So the preventive control might not be required. So you will also need to have, like, for example, the personal hygiene could also be a source of biological hazard, but proper GMP and employee training would also help control that. And unlikely to occur, frozen products, the growth of microorganisms is a biological hazard that is likely to occur. And again, GMP and the food safety plan are both important to control the food safety. So now after we have this step 3, we have to identify if the biological hazard needs the preventive control and the allergen needs to preventive control. So in this case, we need, there is a potential food safety hazards require preventive control. And this is, the key is the word potential. So we need to know if it's actually a potential or not. Now, we identify the hazards, and then when trying to determine if the hazard requires a preventive control, we also consider if your hazard analysis is specific to your operation, process, and product. You may have more or less hazards than the similar product, depending on how your operation is different. So Nicole mentioned that sometimes you also have a Q step later or Q step after. So it depends on how you process your product. Also, are there any resources to help determine potential hazards? Remember that the historical data, validated studies, or guidance document from step 2. And then we will talk about the word validation and verification in the later model. What is the severity of the hazard and the likelihood of occurrence? If both are low, the hazard may not require a preventive control. For example, the pesticide residue on the produce that we also talked earlier, FDA data show that unapproved pesticides or residues approved EPA. The FDA data show that unapproved pesticides are rare in the US. If you know, we also talked about that. Therefore, the occurrence is low. So now, step number 4, we justify your decision. So we have the potential food safety hazards that require preventive control. So now we're just gonna talk about how we're gonna justify this decision making. So before we justify that, we just talk about how we're gonna justify the decision. So both information to auditors and inspectors. So this is like almost like a reminder for us, for ourselves, for auditors, and for inspectors, why we made that decision making. And if you determine that a process doesn't require a preventive control due to a certain criteria, it's always important to make a note. Without making a note, it means that it's never happened. So if the criteria changes in the future, you also need to revise and reassess your hazard analysis as well. So if you cannot justify why a preventive control isn't needed, it may indicate that the control should be used. So now, step number 4 here. So we have that while pasteurization minimizes the likelihood of salmonella, USDA recommends the product be used in cooked foods. Experience has shown salmonella occurs in this ingredient. And for the allergen, is egg and milk are the allergens, so it must be labeled to inform consumers. So allergens across contact is not an issue. All products contain egg and milk. So this is kind of like the reasons that we support the decision making on column 3. Now, step 5 is identify preventive controls for significant hazard. So there are 4 main types of preventive controls. As Kate mentioned, we have process preventive control, allergen preventive control, sanitation preventive control, and supply chain preventive control. So each has different requirements and method of implementation. While, you know, Nicole will talk about the types of preventive controls in greater depth in the following module, I just want to give like a quick overview of this exercise. So now we have the 4 types, again, process, allergen, sanitation, and supply chain. So for the process, is the steps to take in to control a hazard within your food, for example, cooking or metal detecting. Allergen is much for the allergen. We need to make sure that we inform consumers about the allergens, any hidden allergens, and you know, any allergen labeling. For the sanitation controls, it's more for the sanitation steps performed specifically for the control of a hazard identified at specific processing step. And then the supply chain, this is also for controlling by your suppliers, make sure that you have a proper documentation. So now we have this step number 5 here that we also give the measures. So the process central consequences cook step, and then the allergen control, allergen labeling at other steps. So technically, therefore, step number 6 is identifying if the preventive control is applied at this step or not. So if this can be yes or no answer. So even if it's no, this step is an important reminder. So make sure that you also check if we actually need the preemptive control. So the HACCP plays a role in this step, and that a preemptive control needs to be applied at the subsequent step in the process. So for example, here, so this one, even if we have a potential vegetative pathogens that is a potential food safety hazard, but we do not control at this step because it might mean that we have a later step that we have to control this hazard. The same with allergen. We know that the allergen, we have the egg and milk allergen, but the control will be in the later step, which could also mean labeling, and then for the Q step later. So this is kind of like an overview of the 6 steps of how to identify the hazard analysis. So now it's your turn. So as you know that we have to list all of the flow diagrams into the hazard analysis in order to analyze every single step in the hazard analysis. However, because of the time, today we actually will focus only the baking part for your exercise. So we're just gonna do this together. So this is a baking steps. We have 6 steps that we have to identify. Let's practice. Remember the 6 steps that we need to discuss, and then we're just gonna go column by column. And then just to remember, when completing a hazard analysis, this is helpful to have a product description and then understand what the product that we are doing. So having a product description is actually, help remind you what we are doing on this one. Now we come to step number 1 for baking. So the first step, again, we just put in the baking part. So we just go to the second step. I would like everyone to shout out if there is any potential food safety hazards for this baking step. Anyone?
Well, you still have the salmonella and stuff from before.
Yes, that's correct. Anyone else? Do
The
we have
allergens?
any allergen? Anyone else?
The temperature might not be high enough.
Okay, so we are talking about column number 2 for now. So the answer is actually, oh, sorry.
No, sorry. Go ahead.
Reviewed the answers too fast. I apologize. So technically for this baking step, we have the survival of the vegetative pathogens. But why we do not have the chemical allergen for this step?
You control, I was going to say labeling is when you control it.
Exactly. So technically, this is a potential food hazard. So the step for the baking is actually the step that we want to only focus on the hazard that will create the potential hazard. So this is this step we only have biological hazard, and then the next step is we determine, do any potential food safety hazards require a preventive control?
Yes.
Do you think if we need it? Yes?
Yes.
Awesome. Great. And now we are just gonna justify, because I know someone is gonna say why. So why we need the potential food safety hazards require a preventive control. Benito, are you gonna say something?
Why? It's very good to keep that in mind to people that get sick. And it's good to you be the beginning that you start doing something, you do it professionally, and care about the other people that you're gonna consume whatever you're doing. That's the
Great. Awesome. Anyone else?
Right, so there's a risk of illness if the salmonella is not destroyed.
Awesome. That's great. So the cooking is required to kill vegetative pathogens. So that's why this one is required. And now we are going to the next step, is step number 5. What preventive control measures can be applied to this particular one? Process, allergen, sanitation, or supply chain, or others?
Process preventative control.
Anyone else? Does everyone agree? Awesome. So it's process control. So time, temperature to achieve the lethal temperature. And definitely we need a validation study for this one. Now, the last step is the preventive control applied at this step.
Yes.
Yes or no? Yes. Anyone else?
Yes.
Yes. Awesome. No one is saying no?
Yes.
So yes, because this is a kill step, this is the baking part. We actually have, if we go back to the first step that we did for this one, the receiving ingredients that even though the eggs and butter also have the pathogen, but we didn't do any preventive control at the first step, but we actually do the preventive control at the later step because is the baking step. And then now, so technically after you are doing this, you have to do all the steps, not just the baking step, not just the receiving step. And while you perform a hazard analysis, you know, the process is daunting, and it is critical that you ensure the safety of your product. So the key tips for this one is time. An actual hazard analysis will take much longer than just 30 minutes in this class, or 4 hours from this class. It's actually take more time to do a proper hazard analysis, especially the first time that you do, it will actually take the longest. And the more you do it, the shorter it will become. But do not rush because, it's about food safety. We need to take as much time as possible to identify the hazard that may occur in the process of our products. Also, one of the things I learned is you will never do alone. So if you're doing a hazard analysis alone, that is not a good sign. So make sure that you have a team. If possible, it's best to work with a few people who know your operation best and can also provide technical assistance on your potential hazards. It's best to have more people so you can see, we can help figure out if the hazards actually incur in the process. Make a flow diagram. Again, it's go back to the basic, the flow diagram, walk through the process of making your product, and also make a flow diagram that will help identify the potential hazards in the product. And what I actually learned, and I found that it's the most helpful way to do flow diagram, is actually, I personally physically walk through the way the product has been moved. So for example, I start from the loading dock, how the product have been come in, and then I walk through the storage area, and I walk through the manufacturing area to see what how the product travel from the receiving to actually delivering to customers. So that is the best way to kind of visualize how you're gonna create the flow diagram. And then describe your product and process. So similarly to the flow diagram, a product and process description can help identify potential hazards in your product and process. And that also, comes down to part of the allergen that Nicole mentioned earlier, that some of the hidden allergen might incur in one of your ingredients without knowing that it incur. So for example, that is the CISA company that actually use the vegetable stock in making the salsa as part of the recipe or formula, but they forgot that the vegetable stocks have some other ingredients as well. So that is part of the analysis that you need to think. If the vegetable stock actually include any hidden allergens that you might not know, and which means that you also need to identify those hidden allergens in the label as well. So if the vegetable stock include any flour that actually the salsa formula might not have flour in there. So little things like that is actually, the last thing is we don't want to recall. So make sure that you focus on this part and also spend as much time as possible with the team. The last part is use resources. We have provide a variety of resources for aiding in developing and hazard analysis, but there are other resources out there as well. So you don't need to be an expert, but by utilizing resources, you can still perform an accurate, successful hazard analysis that lays the framework for creating a safe food product. So the key for the developing the product, like a food product, is to have a safe product. So this is just a quick wrap up. Is a good food safety plan relies on the hazard analysis, but you don't identify your hazards, you don't control. Like if you don't identify your hazards, you don't control them. A thorough hazard analysis allows you to keep your product safe. So just like food safety management is a roadmap of your operation, and your hazard analysis is a roadmap for your food safety plan. And then we're gonna talk about the preventive control in the later module. So I almost like rushing through this. So I actually finished my chapter a little bit faster. So if anyone has any questions.
It looks like we have a question in the chat from Jody, who's wondering if you would write out the ingredients in the chocolate chips for your original cookie ingredient list on the product description.
Yes. Let me go back to the presentation. So I'm just gonna show you this presentation real quick. That this is a product description. So if you see the product description, we have the product names, and the product description is all natural, preservative-free, shelf-stable, fresh baked chocolate chip cookie. And this is the ingredients that we have to list it. So flour, chocolate chips, butter, white sugar, brown sugar, egg, salt, baking soda, and vanilla. And this will also help you identify what is gonna be the label making that you're gonna make in the later process, and also the allergens that may incur. This is actually will help you. The cookies are like a basic, like recipes that we all know. But as I mentioned, that the salsa example that, one of our clients actually used the vegetable stock in the product, but they didn't realize that there is a flour in the vegetable stock. So that is kind of like, part of that. It's actually okay to have the flour in the vegetable stock, but it's a hidden ingredient because in the main formula, they didn't have the flour. So which means that they need to identify the allergens as wheat in the product as well. So little things like this will actually, help you to create the food, safe food product.
So I guess my question is, on your initial product description that you have up on the screen, you don't need to list the ingredients in the chocolate chips. You just need to have it on the label.
No,
So
we
would
also list the
The
ingredients
process
too.
flow.
Sorry.
They
Go
do
ahead,
need
Kate.
to be on the label. Well,
Yeah.
Kate, you want to
Right.
take it?
Yeah,
they need to be
what
on
I
the
think
label.
you're asking, I was just typing in the chat, but I think you're asking in the ingredients statement on the packaging, do you need to list the sub ingredients?
No,
in
I'm
the-
asking on your actual sheet, on your ingredient list for the chocolate chip cookie that you had for the product description. As a safeguard, wouldn't you want to list the sub ingredients on that?
You should.
Yeah, I mean, I would think, yeah, for your own team's benefit,
Right.
that's a great point. I would say, yeah,
That's
that's
what I'm
gonna
wondering if you
be your
wanted to-
trigger, your reminder.
Yeah, your breakdown of the chocolate chips on that.
Oh, this is I know what you mean because our chocolate chips didn't identify the ingredients under the chocolate chips. Yes, but yes, ideally that is the best practice. I
Okay.
think we need to go back to our resources to, yeah, thank you for saying that.
It's
Yes,
easier as a safeguard, and then you don't have to go back when you're doing the label.
correct.
You
Yep,
already have it in
exactly.
there. Okay.
Yep. And this will also help when you do the next production run. This is like a QA, food safety person that has to also double check if the ingredients are the same in case that we change the brand. Like if we buy white sugar or brown sugar, it might be like a straight ingredients. But for example, like chocolate chips, there are so many brands of the chocolate chips that it could also contain milk. It could also contain something else that we might not know.
Thank you.
Thank you for the questions and to point that out. So, any questions? Awesome. So I will have Nicole take it away.
Okay. Now we'll move on to preventive controls. I just want to keep us on track. I think we're good for time. But now in this module, we're going to discuss each of the 4 preventive controls and components of them. So, yes, that's what I just said. So remember, the preventive controls are procedures you implement to reduce or remove hazards found in your food product at your facility. And the 4 categories we've mentioned are listed right on the slide: process, allergen, sanitation, and supply chain. So from the regulation, process controls include procedures, practices, and processes to ensure the control of parameters during operations such as heat, processing, acidifying, irradiating, and refrigerating foods. The process controls must be appropriate to the nature of the facility and its role in the food safety system. Process controls include parameters associated with the control of a hazard, and it may also be minimum, maximum values or a combination of values to which any biological, chemical, or physical parameter must be controlled to minimize or prevent the hazard from occurring. And this is taken right from the regulation. So what does this really mean? It just means what are we doing to reduce or remove a hazard in our product? That's what process control really is about. So now let's move into this. Here are some examples of process preventive controls. One might be lowering your pH, reducing the water activity, or applying a heat treatment. And on the right, we have some equipment that's used. Number 1 is a pH meter. So it's we're illustrating equipment that will be used to confirm that your process preventive control has been implemented. There's the water activity meter and there's a thermometer. So process preventive controls may use tools to verify that the controls are being met. So some requirements for process preventive controls. It requires establishing a minimum or maximum value, also known as critical limits, which must be met in order to meet control or to have control of the hazard. It includes monitoring that those critical limits were met so that we know we're controlling the hazard. If you don't write it down, you didn't do it. It includes corrective action procedures. It's a good idea to pre-plan if something goes wrong, what you're going to do with the product. Are you going to hold it? Are you going to rework it? Or are you going to destroy it? I mean, ultimately, you don't want to destroy product. So having procedures in place and sort of thinking about corrective actions or things that might go wrong, you can sort of predetermine procedures that you might follow if something goes wrong, so people know what to do, how to handle the product, where to put it, etc. Process preventive controls include a validation procedure for the process. So heating it to 165 or your cook step is heating it to 165. Well, where did that number come from? What scientific evidence do you have that says the 165 is adequate? That's validation is referring to. And then process verification is referring to, are you heating it to 165 every time you cook it? Yes, you've written it down, and the verification is usually record review. So let's talk about establishing critical limits. These are the minimum maximum values of a preventive control that must be reached to minimize or prevent the targeted hazard from taking place. If a critical limit is not reached, you can assume you have an unsafe food product, and your records will show that critical limits were met for every batch. So record keeping is of utmost importance. So looking at our cookie exercise, what are some of the critical limits for our baking step? At the baking step, we identified that we might have salmonella. And so we need to make sure that we are heating the cookie to a high enough temperature to kill salmonella. Our critical limit is not taking the temperature of the cookie, because that's, say we have a dry, brittle cookie, that's not going to be, that's not going to work. So what we're doing instead is sometimes the critical limits aren't monitoring the temperature of the product, but it might be monitoring other parameters that would ensure safety. And so in this situation, we're monitoring the oven temperature to make sure it's high enough, at or above 350 degrees Fahrenheit. And we're making sure that we cook our cookies for at least 13 minutes. So these critical limits are clearly stated, and it includes the processing parameters of the temperature and the time. In this form, we also have records. So at this baking step, we have records that document each critical limit that's met. So we have our temperature log, our corrective action record, and then we'll verify all of the records to make sure that the temperature and the time were accurate. So usually record review occurs within 7 working days of production. And I want to specify working days because especially in smaller operations or using a shared use kitchen, you may not be operating 5 days straight or 5 consecutive days. So it's within 7 working days is how it's written into the regulation. So we also have monitoring, and this is how you ensure your critical limits were met by writing down the critical limit. So elements of monitoring include what to monitor, how to monitor it, how often or frequently do you do this, and who is going to do it. Next, we have corrective action. So what do you do if something goes wrong? You want to be prepared and have an idea beforehand. Are you going to reprocess the food? If it's safe and it can be reprocessed, that's great. You might initially have to hold the product while you assess the safety of it. So what are you going to do when you hold it? How do you segregate it? How do you mark it off from the rest of your product? And if you destroy it because you determine it's not safe, document the destruction. Don't just throw it in the garbage. At the Department of Health, if someone has to destroy food, they dump bleach on it because people will dumpster dive. So you need to document that you destroyed it and that you took efforts to make sure it can't get back onto the shelf for consumers. If you are implementing corrective actions, there are record keeping procedures that you might want to follow to make sure you adequately document the procedure. And this includes the product identification. What product did you have an issue with? How much of it? What lot numbers? What were the details of the deviation? What's the root cause for the deviation? What actions did you take to prevent this from reoccurring? What was the disposition of the implicated product? And then did you verify the corrective action was properly implemented? And this is an example of a corrective action. So we have the date of the record, the date and time of the deviation. And then in this example, description of the deviation, we're saying that the paddle mixer was observed to have a nick in the blade at the post-production sanitation inspection. This issue was observed by the cleaning and sanitation operator. So what did they do? Production was halted when the error was discovered. The entire day's production was segregated based on production lot. All implicated product was sent over to XYZ Productions for use of their metal detector. Maintenance inspected the unit to ensure that the blade alignment was not too close to the bowl to reduce metal on metal contact. And then they say who took the action, CC ahoy, the amount of product that was involved. They talk about what they did. Every case was sent through a calibrated metal detector. What happened? One case did not pass, and that case was disposed of. And then this is reviewed, and then they date it. So this is a simple example of a corrective action record. And you just want to make sure you collect all the information of what happened. So I've talked about validation a little and verification, and they're both V words. So I want to just clarify what the two are. So validation means obtaining and evaluating scientific and technical evidence that a control measure, combination of control measures, or the food safety plan, when implemented as written, is capable of controlling the identified hazards. And this definition is from the regulation. But what does it mean? It means, does your food safety plan control the hazards you identified? And you need to validate your food safety plan before you start production. Although there are examples where you can't do that, and that's allowed. And there are certain steps you need to take if that's the case. So validation is the scientific evidence that your process preventive controls will control what you say they will control. Ways to validate controls include using scientific literature. The FDA food code has a lot of information on proper cooking temperatures, and that's a great resource. Expert opinion or recommendations. Implant testing also can help you validate controls or determine validation controls, and using mathematical models. Validation should take place before implementing the plan if possible. Whenever a change in your process occurs, if you have new equipment, for example, you want to make sure that you're meeting the safety parameters. And whenever reanalysis indicates that there's a need, you should look at the validation again. Validation is science-based. It's essential processing controls for safety, and it established critical limits for safety controls. So looking at our cookie example, we have science-based, and this slide is overwhelming, so don't worry about it, because we're going to go into detail on each of the three things that I'm pulling up. Well, we have science-based information. This is our validation study for why we are cooking our cookies at 350 degrees for 13 minutes. How did we determine that was adequate? So we used a science-based study. We took essential processing parameters from that study, and then we looked at our cookie and established critical limits. So looking at the science-based study, so someone was hired by this cookie company to help them validate their cooking parameters. And what this person did is they went and found a study published in 2014 that looked at peanut butter cookies. And then when they were inoculated with high levels of salmonella and baked at 350 for 15 minutes, they had no salmonella. So we're going to use this information to help us determine what our cooking parameters are going to be. It's not going to be the same because, first of all, we're not making a peanut butter cookie. And our oven is different than the oven used in this study. So we have different things that are going to impact us. So we need to verify that this validated study will in fact work for us. But it's going to give us information as a starting point. Oh, and so they used 28-gram portions of dough. The water activity was 0.82. And then it has the temperature and the time that it was baked at. So we'll use this information in developing our parameters. So next, this person identified the following processing parameters that need critical limits for food safety in the cookie. And that included the convection oven temperature to make sure that we achieve a specified minimum product temperature. It includes the baking time in the oven, and it includes the weight or the size of the dough. So based on the information obtained from the study, and from an in-house study, we determined that the critical limit for baking temperature is 350 degrees Fahrenheit, and that the time needed for our cookies was 13 minutes to reach that kill step, and that we needed to have dough portions that were 28 grams, no larger, no smaller, especially not larger. So we're using science-based information to determine essential processing parameters and to help us establish our critical limits. So in-house studies might be useful because a lot of the information that you find might not be applicable to your exact product or process. So you need to maybe you need to do an in-house study, or maybe you need to send it out and have someone else look at it. But these are things that will need to be done to ensure that your parameters are accurate. So I've also talked about verification, and verification is the application of methods, procedures, tests, and other evaluations in addition to monitoring to determine whether a control measure has been operating as intended. So basically, are the controls that you implement being performed correctly to control the hazard? So verification activities take many forms, and it can include record review, which is usually done within 7 working days. Checking equipment calibration records. Product sampling and testing is another thing that's sometimes done to verify, that the accuracy of your process. Visual inspections of labels for allergen information, environmental monitoring, and I'll talk a little bit about that a little later on in this module. And third-party audits are also verification activities. So looking at this cookie example, we have a verification, we have a metal detection verification protocol. So within a week of record creation, a qualified employee checks the metal detection log to verify there are no signs of damage present to mixing bowls or mixer blades. They sign and date each record, and then someone reviews, signs, and dates the corrective action records within a week of the deviation. So this is just an example of a record review verification procedure. It's basically records are being checked to ensure that the preventive control is being properly performed. So validation, just in review, to review the two V words, validation is how do I know my control will do what I say it will? Whereas verification is how do I know if my control is doing what I say it will? And you must verify all preventive controls, and you must validate all process preventive controls. So in summary, for process preventive controls, validated and verified procedures are needed to protect against hazards in your product. And you must have documentation to prove that this was done. You must establish critical limits and have monitoring activities for those hazard controls. So now moving on to allergen preventive controls. Remember, there are 8 allergens that must be labeled. If you have an allergen, you have a chemical hazard, and therefore you need a food safety plan and an allergen preventive control. So allergen preventive controls are implemented as one of two things. It's either at labeling, which is important to alert the consumer that the allergen is in the food. You need to ensure labels are accurately state the allergen and that they're on the right product. And then also another allergen control measure is preventing cross-contact. And this is typically done when a facility makes multiple products with different allergens. And it might include cleaning all shared equipment or avoiding in-process and post-processing allergen cross-contact. Excuse me. So remember, allergen labeling is so important. Undeclared allergens are the #1 source of recalls in the United States. I see things come across my news feed every day about recalls for undeclared allergens. Ensuring no undeclared allergens is important. Check your labels on receipt to verify all allergens in the product are listed. I mean, you can check it just when you put the label on the product, but a good practice might be to check your label when you receive it if it's pre-printed to make sure it's accurate, and also when you're putting it on the product. You don't want to wait until you're labeling your products to realize that your label is inaccurate. So preventing cross-contact. If you have multiple products with different allergens, have a plan in place to prevent cross-contact. And this is just the transfer of allergens from one product to one that doesn't have that allergen in it. If you process multiple products in a day, start with the product with the least number of allergens or with no unique allergens, and finish with a product that has the most allergens or unique allergens. This reduces the risk of cross-contact. Other things that you can do to prevent cross-contact include zoning, which is where certain areas are allergen-free or contain only products with certain allergens. So you're sort of zoning the space where you produce your product to limit where allergens are, or to put them all in one setting. So looking at our cookie example, the current model does not have an allergen cross-contact because we're only making one cookie, so we don't have any unique allergens. But say we wanted to start making a peanut butter cookie, what changes or considerations should be made? And one might be that we add a label check for finished product to ensure the right label is on the right product for all products. We might be implementing a sanitation preventive control and monitoring it to make sure there's no allergen cross-contact. So I just said sanitation while I'm talking about allergens. And I just want to point out that if you have an allergen and you want to prevent cross-contact, you need to clean and sanitize It doesn't matter if you're calling this an allergen preventive control or a sanitation preventive control, as long as you're controlling the prevention of cross contact. So I just want to point that out while I go through. So if we decide to make a peanut butter cookie and we only made chocolate chip cookies before, you know, obviously we want to make the chocolate chip cookie first because there's no unique allergens, unlike the peanut butter cookie, which has peanuts. So just in summary of the allergen preventive controls, again, there are two types of controls, and that's labeling and preventing cross contact. And undeclared allergens are the most common cause for recall. So check your labels because mistakes are made every day. Now moving on to sanitation preventive controls. Sanitation, this is referring to sanitation performed specifically for an identified hazard. It's not just regular cleaning and sanitizing. So sanitation controls are typically implemented to control potential presence of environmental pathogens in your processing environment. This is really important if you have food that's exposed to the environment before you package it. If it receives its kill step or some sort of control, but it's still exposed to the environment and then you package it, you're going to need to have an environmental monitoring program to monitor for pathogens in the environment to make sure they're not able to get into your product. And this is just reduces the risk of cross-contamination. Sanitation controls intend to reduce the risk of cross-contamination from raw product to cooked product. So for example, if our cookie dough was hand-formed on a surface that it was also used to package the cooked product, we would need a sanitation preventive control on that table in between the raw dough step and the cooked product step. So how do you know if you need a sanitation procedure as a preventive control or not? And it's all comes down to your hazard analysis. So now I talked about environmental monitoring, and I just want to elaborate a little bit more on what that is. If you have a sanitation preventive control, you should implement an environmental monitoring program. And what this does is it's swabbing your environment, those food contact surfaces and other surfaces nearby, sampling it to determine if there are resident pathogens establishing residence in the environment. And you want to prevent that from happening so that you can prevent that from becoming a problem with your food product. This is often an issue in facilities with ready-to-eat products. Your environmental monitoring program should be specific to your facility. And there is guidance for listeria and ready-to-eat foods. So the FDA has a document, and the link is on this slide. And also an effective program tries to find the food safety issue before it contaminates the food. So if you have an environmental monitoring program, you are going to find positive samples of whatever you're measuring, and that's okay. If you're swabbing your environment and you always have nothing, that might be an alarm because you're going to find things, and knowing what to do when you find some positives is the key, like because you want to find it before it gets into your food. So another thing I talked about for sanitation controls is the idea of hygienic zoning. And this is where different areas require different levels of hygiene. So non-manufacturing areas such as offices or employee areas in your maintenance shop won't require the same level of attention as areas where basic GMPs are applied, or where the primary pathogen control areas where your food production is occurring. So you can implement hygienic zoning regardless of whether you have a sanitation preventive control or not. And it just allows you to break up your facility and look at the areas with different scrutiny. So transition areas like entry rooms, hallways that lead to GMP areas won't get as much scrutiny as a basic GMP area, which would include your receiving, a store where you store your food products, or shipping area. And then your primary pathogen control area includes your processing floor or areas where hazards are controlled. So this is an example of a hygienic zoning map, and it's just basically breaking down that entire facility into different zones. And the red area represents your primary pathogen control area. So it allows you to just see how pathogens might transfer between areas as well. it's a good idea to do this, to sort of lay out your facility and see what areas might pose a risk. So to summarize, sanitation preventive controls documentation. All hazard and all preventive controls required records. Documentation activities may include the cleaning and sanitizing of food contact surfaces, or the prevention of allergen cross-contact and cross-contamination. You want to make sure that your documentation includes the procedure and how frequently the sanitation activities are going to be conducted. So to summarize sanitation preventive controls, there are 2 examples where you might need to implement a sanitation control, and that's to avoid environmental pathogens from contaminating your food. This is especially with ready-to-eat foods exposed to the environment before packaging, and to avoid, and it also includes cleaning to avoid cross-contact. So look at your operation and your hygienic zoning, and that can help you reduce your food safety risk. And now moving on to supply chain. So suppliers, sometimes you're not applying the control, the supplier is. Suppliers, sorry, my phone is dinging. Suppliers can apply controls to manage hazards and incoming ingredients. A supply chain preventive control requires documentation from the supplier, and it also requires ongoing verification that the control was applied. So for the purpose of this program, we're not really diving into this topic, but if you want more information on this, please reach out to us. So what are some of the next steps for preventive controls in your operation? This is referring to a flash drive. Hold on. Okay, this is just referring to the stuff on a flash drive. So preventive control summary. In summary, food safety focuses on hazards that pose a risk to human health, and that includes biological, chemical, and physical hazards. Preventive controls to ensure food safety are categorized into 4 categories: process, allergen, sanitation, and supply. And it doesn't matter what you call anything if you're confused between allergen and sanitation, as long as you're implementing the right controls, that's the most important. All process controls need a science-based validated study showing that the control will, or the implementation of the control will control the hazard. You don't need validation for allergen controls. And that's really just because they don't have ways to validate all of the allergens out there at this date and time. Food safety preventive strategies must be monitored. You want to establish record-keeping procedures for the monitoring activities and verify that the food safety plan is being implemented as written. So that is it for preventive controls. Does anyone have any questions, or did you want to discuss any of this? I'm looking in the chat right now. Did anyone have any questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
That's not completely related to the content, but do you have any advice on liability insurance and or for the small producer?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't gotten into a lot of those discussions. Have Ploy or Kate, have you gotten into those discussions?
We can provide like a contact info of the insurance agency, and because your need might be different from other people, so I think the best way is to reach out to the insurance agency, and I can share the contact after this class.
Oh, great, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, we have a short list too. We generally just encourage people to get, I mean, yes, definitely get liability insurance, including product liability.
Going off of that, is liability insurance required for selling value-added products?
In a lot of cases, I think yes, like they're going to ask to see that.
Okay.
Yeah, a buyer is going to ask to see that.
Yeah, and mainly to protect yourself, especially from a recall. Like if you have a recall, that's bad.
Mm-hmm.
Without the food liability insurance.
Yeah, most like farmers markets and all of that require you to have product liability before you can sell there. So, and if you're doing it on your own, you need to protect yourself.
Sure.
And also having records to demonstrate you've done the right thing. I mean, a lot of what we talk about is, you know, do this so you don't make people sick. But what about you've done this and your food is incorrectly, you know, what people think made them sick isn't always the food that made them sick. So, you know, unless there's a proper investigation to find your food, you know, it also can protect you by having proper records to show you've done everything right.
And do the insurance companies recognize the steps you're taking if you can verify you're taking these good steps to get a, you know, a better rate? I'm just curious.
I don't know.
I have no idea.
Usually it doesn't go that way. It goes by how much, like how much you want to get to protect each of your products. And it also depends on what else, like almost like a health insurance, that what is a deductible that you want, you know, little things like that. So, but the minimum usually is around $300 a year. But usually the products like consumer packaged goods, liability insurance, the more you have the products, like if you have one SKU, it costs less than when you have 10 SKUs.
But as Chloe just said, $300 a year is a pretty small, I mean, liability insurance is not out of line. It's not crazy. It's not going to be tens of thousands of dollars or anything like that.
Maximum is like for a small food business is around $1,000 a year. So it really depends again on how many products you have, how much you want to cover. You know, some people have touch base on like children food, like food for toddler, that is a little bit more expensive than for adults only.
I guess I have a question regarding any potential I guess what I'll term like legal stuff going forward. So let's say I've got all my ingredients, I've rented out a commercial kitchen space, I'm making my products there. I have my food safety, you know, certification, so I'm certified to process and create foods. And I've created all the food safety procedures and mappings, documentations that we talked about today. Is there anything else I need to consider, or can I just start making my product on a very small scale, mind you, farmers markets, and then selling them at these markets, or is there other steps I'm missing?
I think for the most part, you'll have it covered. I think the individual town in which the farmers market is located might ask some additional stuff of you, like, can you submit an application with the local board of health? And they'll ask, I'm trying to think what else they tend to ask for. Really just that you have a licensed kitchen. And then I think the next phase to think about, which is usually a bigger step for food manufacturers, is when you transition to wholesale and you apply for a mass wholesale license, or maybe you know, wholesale license in another state if they require it. That's a little bit of a heavier lift. So they'll ask for some of what we talked about today, and then they'll also ask for some more facility specific policies like a food defense plan, an emergency action plan. And there are great like templates and resources, but there's a list of like 10 or 12 things you have to prepare for the wholesale license. Shout out to Sean, who's here from the Worcester Regional Food Hub and just launched an awesome 6-week course on getting your wholesale food license. So putting a plug in for that, Sean, I hope that's okay.
Awesome. But for the scale that I'm looking at right now, again, just like farmers markets within the Massachusetts and possibly Rhode Island area, there's no specific licensing or registration I need to file for in order to sell those value added products.
If you go over state lines, you might have to comply with all the federal regulations.
Sure. Okay.
So staying within Mass lines would be the easiest for you.
So on that note, what does it look like? I'm sorry, I keep throwing questions at you. So Edible Homescapes, my farm, is located in Westport, Massachusetts, but it's possible that my commercial kitchen that I'm renting, the production facility, is located in Rhode Island. So it's ingredients made in one state and business located in one state, but value added products made in another. Is there any conflict there that I should know about?
I don't think so.
You usually can you remind me if your product is shelf stable, like acidified shelf stable, or it's just the refrigerated product?
It will be shelf stable. We're making shelf stable jams and pickles.
So with the acidified shelf stable products, you need to get the wholesale license regardless. And then the wholesale license will actually, cover the whole production. And then when you sell through Vermont or across the state, that because the acidified shelf stable is like a totally different regulation because you need to register the product with the FDA. And with that, it's kind of like cover that part as like anyway. And then when you go to the farmer's market, you will just show them your wholesale license, and that they will issue you the farmer's market license for each location.
Okay, so so if I'm producing my products in a separate state from my business, even though I'm very small scale, I would need to get a wholesale license anyway?
Yes, that is a regulation. So even you produce 12 jars a year, you still need a wholesale license with the schedule process, with the better process control, school serve safe and everything. And let's say I only know Massachusetts. So if you, let's say if you are gonna produce in Rhode Island, I am not so sure if the requirements are the same, but in Massachusetts, the city, like the city level doesn't do the acidified shelf stable products. They only leave it to the state.
Yeah, for certified shelf stable products in Rhode Island, that's not allowed for farm home food manufacturer. So you'd need to do that in a licensed facility for Rhode Island. And if it's in a licensed facility, then you can, and you're producing it in Rhode Island, then I think you can sell it in Rhode Island.
Okay.
Isn't it true like you're under different jurisdictions if you cross state lines? Whereas like you might be under state regulations and have certain exemptions, but if you're selling products across states, you're now in federal, like FDA. So you're going to have higher standards of food safety and regulations once you cross state lines. So, and depending on the size of your business, I think too.
Yeah, no, you're right.
And I'm gonna pop a link in the chat. What you're talking about and what Floyd referenced, you will have to register what's called your facility, essentially your business with the FDA. So I'll pop a link in the chat for what that looks like. It's not complicated, but you will have to do that. And then there's another form that you have to fill out. I can never remember. It's like 4258E or something like that for acidified products.
Okay, and now, so if I was producing and selling all within Massachusetts, for example, I keep everything within the same state, getting the wholesale license and all of these other federal regulations would not be strictly necessary?
Yes, usually in Massachusetts, is the wholesale license cover the wholesale and also the retail for the acidified shelf stable products. But if anyone in this call that has like refrigerated or frozen, you need to get both if you want to do that, like both wholesale and retail. But for the acidified shelf stable that controlled by schedule process, that is only the state. And you will follow what the state requires you, which is the wholesale license is actually require recall plan, require sanitation, SSOP, that type of thing, like everything.
So I'm going to need to get a wholesale license regardless, is what you're saying?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Yeah, Rhode Island's a little different, so it's hard for me to answer. Rhode Island only has one Department of Health too. We don't have state departments of health.
We have in our facility, we're in Western Mass again, and we have a bunch of Connecticut producers who for a long time were not getting wholesale licenses because Connecticut doesn't really require a wholesale license for food manufacturing. It's sort of funny, but the state did just reach out and ask that everybody operating out of our facility get a mass wholesale license. So that did just come up like this year, actually.
Yeah, and a lot of our clients at Commonwealth Kitchen, many of them, they are acidified shelf stables. They only get the wholesale license in Massachusetts, and then their products have been distributed through New England area, and some of them expand to the Midwest and that type of thing. So technically, as Kate mentioned earlier, that the buyers actually more strict than the state regulation. So you still need like HACCP plan that of other documentations to support that. And that's pretty much like when you go through the distributor and the buyers, that they actually kind of like cover that as well. But I'm not so sure about direct to consumers. I know that the Whole Foods is like receives the product in Massachusetts, and if they're gonna distribute somewhere, I think it's kind of like their problems. So that's how we operate here. I think, Lei, are you selling your tea outside Massachusetts as well? Lei has a lot of stores.
Yes, I was the Massachusetts company, but I started business making the Hope and Mint, Rhode Island. So I need to get the wholesale license from Rhode Island. After I get this license, I can sell in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island. It's anywhere, store or market. So I think that's well to ask that question about.
Thank you, Lei. So Lei has been selling her tea through Stop and Shop as well. So she has 80 stores throughout Massachusetts. So that is kind of like Stop and Shop is taking, like the distributor actually taking over the distribution part. So we just deal with the distributor.
If Stop and Shop take you in, they will find a store distributor for you. So they gave me the Davidson in Connecticut. So I work with Davidson, not from Davidson to tell me I need a promotion or something. Their direct deal with Stop and Shop. So that's in the process. And most of the time you got in a big chain, everybody want to take you in. That bigger distributor also like to get. But if you just got one or two small retailers, and you have to contact to distributor to work that step, And I suggest when you start your distributor yourself, because distributor take 20 to 35% really for small business to start. You better do everything you can to learn the process, to learn everything you're still able to learn. Yeah, after everybody know your brand name and the big company want to take you in. Distributor, you don't need to worry about by that time. Yeah, that's just my little experience.
We can we'll talk about office hours in a minute too, but we'll talk about some of that, like what the markups look like across the chain in the product development lifecycle office hours.
I wanted to mention, it looks like Jody had a question in the chat. Can anyone speak to the use of fresh garlic and the associated pathogens?
Oh, I think with fresh garlic, you're looking at anything coming out of the soil that can be on it. So yeah, there's going to be issues. There's a guy in Rhode Island that wants to do value-added garlic, and he thought he could do it at his home using the home farm food manufacturer, but it's only for herbs and spices. He can't dry garlic at home. So now he has to be a processor if he wants to do that. So now we're talking about all the steps we'll have to take for that, just to dry garlic. But I think in terms of pathogens, it could be anything on the soil, Clostridium botulinum. That's why you can't stick it in the oil.
Isn't there also, Nicole, a wonder if there is, I think someone maybe asked this, but there is a database which outlines pathogens of concern for like a wide variety of ingredients. Am I making that up? I think it's a Canadian publication.
Yes, there's a hazard analysis document. I don't have the link for that, but I have the printout. But then there's an appendix 2 for, so if you the FDA has a guidance document for preventive controls for human food, and Appendix 2 is a big table of different pathogens. It's not always clear. I mean, they might have selected a lot of pathogens, and then you have to think about your product and process to see which ones are really applicable. But it's a good starting point. Let me see if I can find that and stick that link in the.
We're going to send a folder with a follow-up. We'll send a follow-up email. CISA will include a folder of resources. I think the Canadian document is in that folder.
Yeah, I think so.
If I'm remembering correctly. So that'll be a great tool as you sit down to do your hazard analysis to think about biological concerns.
Yeah,
because who would know these things? The Bad Bug book, Sean, is that is that the title of it? That rings a bell for me.
Yeah, Bad Bug book.
Yeah.
It's all natural toxins.
That's an FDA publication, so that's US.
Yeah.
Awesome.
It's
I put
292 pages.
I put the appendix link in. I wouldn't necessarily print it, but it's like 256 pages, but it's a good starting point. It's similar to the other the Canadian document.
Cool. Any other questions before we wrap up?
Me again, sorry. I do just want to make sure I fully understand. So my current model is direct to consumer. I don't intend to sell to other shops for wholesale. Despite that, I still need a wholesaler's license.
I am pretty confident. So if you are acidified, shelf stable, that is the wholesale only. The best way for everyone here, like you can reach out. So first, you can reach out to your town or your city first, and then that's how they're gonna like guide you. Like, oh, we are not doing this. You need to apply for the wholesale license.
Sure.
Because I have been through like part of this, so I know that acidified shelf stable, it has to go through the wholesale license. And then after we get the wholesale license, you need to register with the FDA, even though you are very, very small. So that is like regulated by the FDA because it's the botulinum thing. So for the recall and stuff. So that's why they require that. That will be just like a little bit of the exemption if you are like tomato sauce, or if you are acid food that is not acidified. So like if you don't add any acids into the food, that is almost like an exemption, but it's always best to register anyway. Like anyone who do like tomato puree or anything that you don't technically add acids into that, like the food is already like sour, that is almost kind of like a little exemption that you don't really need to register with the FDA.
Okay, thank you.
Would the cream honey have anything to do with that, with the wholesale license?
Cream and honey?
Creamed honey.
Creamed honey,
I think
like
he's whipping the honey.
flavored honey that you whip.
It's like a maple cream, kind of similar.
Yes.
I don't know the answer to that.
I don't know. I mean, I know honey in general is not, well, I guess it is a high risk for babies, but it's generally a low water activity product.
Yeah, and honey is like acidified. It's like the pH is low as well, if I don't remember wrong.
Yeah, that's a good question.
We
Okay,
might need to get back to you on that one.
Yeah, so what was that question again exactly? Let me write it
If
down.
cream honey has to get the wholesale.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, so that will be you guys because I'm not in Mass.
We'll try to find that out for you. I want to say
Maybe-
yes, the answer, but I'm not positive.
It may depend on what you're adding.
Like freeze-dried strawberries.
Like strawberry flavor cream honey.
Yeah.
So if you add strawberry, and if the pH is lower than, you know, like 4.6, that would consider acidified shelf stable. So that would fall into the acidified shelf stable, and you need to get the schedule process for that. But if the pH is not there, it means that that product cannot be shelf stable, and that you need to either like refrigerate or freeze the product. it means that you can actually get the retail license.
But you need a scheduled process for acidified foods?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
And also for water activity. So I think
Oh,
I
acidified, yes.
wonder
I'm
if
sorry.
creamed honey is a water activity product. I suspect that that's what makes it shelf stable is the low water activity. I could be wrong.
Yeah, no, I'm agreeing with you.
In which case it would fall under that same category that we're talking about. And you'd have to register it with the FDA.
How could I test the acidity on the creamed honey?
You might be able to Google like standard, like you might be able to Google it in short. Often you can just like figure out what the pH of something is by Googling it. If not, you could like buy simple pH testing equipment, or you could find a commercial kitchen or a lab near you that can do a test for you. Where are you located?
In Massachusetts?
In what
Holyoke?
town?
Holyoke?
In Holyoke. You could talk with there's a kitchen in Holyoke called Serve Food. They probably have pH testing equipment there.
Could you spell that out for me, the name?
Yeah, it's Serve, like SERVE, Serve Food.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that might be a place to start. If not, you can call us. We're in Greenfield, but you could mail it to me and I could test it at our facility.
All right.
But I bet we can
No,
Google
I'm
it.
too far away, or I would say I would help.
I have a question. I'm interested to know currently what resources there are available at UMass, for instance, of research into food substance. For instance, as a byproduct of the bean cooking and miso making, there is a bean juice as a byproduct, which we don't use, but I know it's a very rich substance, but I don't know in what ways it might be able to be used. For instance, lecithin is derived from such substance. But I just wonder if what resources are available to us at UMass or elsewhere outside of the commercial, research institutions.
Yeah, I know in terms of like URI, it's just a matter of who has interest in things like that. And we used to have a guy that did a lot with like seafood byproducts, but he's since retired, even though he's still around. But I think he's losing his space like recently because they're moving us all around.
Yeah.
So it's just, but I don't know about UMass. I would think it'd be the same thing. It's just a matter of someone having an interest in looking at that.
I know for sure Cornell has someone who can help, but you can reach out to the link that Kate put it in the chat earlier, the Food Venture, Cornell Food Venture Center. Because I work with them for the byproduct of the miso, like soybean pulps, because technically you need to have like another process to get it sale as a commercial products. You cannot sell byproducts ingredients to just, for commercialized use. That's Cornell has that resource, but I don't know if they will charge any fee and stuff like that.
Yeah, I went to Cornell, so maybe they'll help me.
They should. I also just, bean juice is cool. There are lots of businesses these days who are trying to do things with scrap produce or byproduct. We're like lots of fizzy drinks using whey. We have a couple of clients at our facility that are making products out of scraps. So it might even be, connecting with an individual or doing some poking around to see who locally is doing cool things with scrap product and seeing if they have an interest. Like I'd love to mention that to a couple of folks that are working out of our kitchen. If you're open to it, I could connect you. They are essentially developing things with scraps and always looking for new ideas.
Yeah, please do.
What kind of beans? Just curious.
Soybeans, but also chickpeas.
Okay.
Are the primary source. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I have thoughts on that. I might follow up with you separately.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions before we move into our evaluation?
And I just want to say you guys have been a great interactive group. We really appreciate the interaction. It makes it so much more enjoyable on our end. But I just want to say that before I forget.
Agreed. Thanks, everybody. All right, well, let's turn it over to CISA staff. If you guys want to go ahead and say a few words about the evaluation and then our poll for next week's office hours.
Sure, yeah. So I am just going to drop a link in the chat to our evaluation form. It would be great if you guys could just take the last few minutes of this time to fill that out. It should really be only 5 to 10 minutes to fill out. And it is really helpful for us in getting feedback in how helpful this workshop was for you. And it's really helpful for us in grant reporting. So we're able to like continue funding for this kind of work. So I just, I'm about to drop this in the chat. There you go. So yeah, if anyone would like to fill that out like right now, that would be great. But before you do that, the other thing we would like to do is to get some feedback from you all on what the best times are for office hours. So I actually have created a Zoom poll that I'm going to pull up now for that. And let's see, not letting me do it right now. Maybe could one of the other co-hosts see if when you pull up polls, if it's coming up?
Yes, I see it.
Yeah, it's there.
It is there. Okay, great. Could one of you pull that up for me for some reason?
Do you want me to launch it?
Yeah. Let's see
Okay.
how it goes.
Do you see it?
I'm not seeing. Is it everyone else seeing it?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, great.
Yep.
And presenters, you guys can let me know if this is wrong, but I think what we want is for everyone to sign up for as many slots as they're available, and then the presenters will choose one of those slots on each day. They won't be available all of those times. They're just looking for a 1 2-hour slot when the most people are available.
Exactly.
And then I think we'll let you guys know in a follow-up email when those slots will be.
Exactly.
Thank you. All right, I think those 2 things are it on our end. Thank you so much for doing both those things.
Yeah, thanks to CISA for organizing and for getting so many people in the room. This has been our biggest class yet, and I think it went really well. So thanks to everybody for being engaged. And I also just want to do just a quick plug for our organization. We do lots of individual technical assistance, one-on-one sessions with folks who need support around launching a food product. So if you have specific questions about a food product, feel free to shoot me an email. So our organization houses the Western Mass Food Processing Center and the Mass Ag Innovation Center. Both of those programs offer free technical assistance. So feel free to email myself or Trisha, who's also on the call today, and we can get you synced up with the right person.
I just want to say thank you to everyone, and thank you to Molly that did the weed work behind the scenes. A lot of what we do is, like get the word out, but also like one-to-one communication, phone calls and getting the right people that we know need this information. But sometimes they're like on their own, like live happening. So, but we got a good crowd. I'm glad. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
Just want to check, has everyone been able to access the link to the evaluation form? Is that working? Everyone? Yes. Okay, amazing.
So once you've filled out the evaluation and the poll, you are free to go. Hope everybody receives some clarity about regulation and also what it means to put together a food safety plan today. And we'll be in touch with a follow-up email probably early next week, and that'll come from CISA with lots more information and dates and times for those office hours.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for all the evaluations I see coming in. We appreciate it.
You.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See ya.